Good afternoon and welcome to the Friday, March 8th, 2019 meeting of the Fort Ord Reuse Authority. I'm going to call the meeting to order. And first order of business is the Pledge of Allegiance. Let's see, how about Dr. Diffenbaugh, would you lead us in the pledge? And our next order of business is closed session. Mr. Giffen, would you alert us all to what we're going to be doing in closed session?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Chair, members of the board and public. Item 3A, closed session, conference with legal counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, Keep Fort Ord Wild versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority, Monterey County Superior Court case number 17CV4540. That's a matter of pending litigation. And item 3B, conference with legal counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, Marina Community Partners, LLC versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority, Monterey County Superior Court case number 18CV871. That's also pending litigation.
Thank you. Is there any member of the public who would like to comment on the items in closed session? Seeing no one coming forward, we will recess to closed session and return as soon as we can. Going to reconvene the Fort Ord Reuse Authority Board of Directors meeting for Friday, March 8th. Council, would you let the public know what happened in closed session?
Yes, thank you, Chair, members of the board and public. Item 3A, closed session, conference with legal counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, Keep Fort Ord Wild versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority. That matter was reported upon to the board. Status was updated, and there is nothing to report out. And item 3B, conference with legal counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, Marina Community Partners, LLC versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority. The matter was also reported to the board, and the status was given, and there's nothing to report out on that one either.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is acknowledgments, announcements, and correspondence. And since the agenda was put together, it came to FORA's attention that Mayor Camp from Pacific Grove is being honored by the Monterey Peninsula Chamber of Commerce, and so there was a request to add as an urgency item a resolution for FORA to be able to pass along to him at that ceremony. So if there's someone who would like to make that motion that we add a resolution for Mayor Camp to the agenda. Okay, motion by Oglesby, seconded perhaps by Garfield. Thank you. Any discussion by board members? Any member of the public wanting to comment on this? All right, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. It has been added. So, all right, it looks like Director Garfield is going to read it into the record for us.
Okay. It is hereby resolved by the Fort Ord Reuse Authority Board of Directors that whereas the Fort Ord Reuse Authority adopted Resolution 1902 honoring Bill Camp for all his years of service on the Fort Ord Reuse Authority Board, and whereas in 2008 Bill Camp was elected to the Pacific Grove City Council and to the office of mayor in 2012, serving 3 terms as mayor through 2018, and whereas Mayor Camp has served on the boards of the Fort Ord Reuse Authority as chair of the Finance Committee, the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, including a term as president, and the Monterey Peninsula Regional Water Authority as president, and whereas Bill Camp for the League of California Cities was a member of the Executive Committee of the Central Coast Division and the division's representative to the annual League Strategy Setting Forum and a member of the Governance, Transparency, and Labor Relations Policy Committee, and whereas Mayor Camp rarely found a challenge he could not address, and whereas the Monterey Peninsula Chamber of Commerce has now acknowledged Bill Camp for his years of service to the Monterey region by awarding him the Ruth Vreeland Memorial Public Official of the Year Award. Now, therefore, the Fort Ord Reuse Authority Board further acknowledges Bill Camp for his ongoing service to the community and join others in expressing appreciation as he receives the Ruth Vreeland Memorial Public Official of the Year Award. Upon motion by board member, seconded by board member, fill in the blanks, the foregoing resolution was passed this 8th day of March 2019.
Thank you. Can that be construed as a motion to approve the resolution? Would someone like to second that? All right. Motion by Garfield, seconded by Morton. Any discussion of the resolution? Any members of the public wanting to comment? All right. We'll close public comment. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for reading that. Okay. All right, I'm going to save that for a little later. Any other acknowledgments, announcements, or correspondence?
No, Chair.
Great, thank you. Madam Clerk, could we have a roll call, please?
Supervisor Parker. Here. Supervisor Phillips. Supervisor Adams. Here. Councilmember John Gagliotti. Here. Councilmember Frank O'Connell. Here. Mayor Pro Tem Gail Morton. Councilmember Alan Hoffa. Here. Mayor Ian Oglesby. Here. Councilmember John Wizard. Here. Mayor Marianne Carbone. Here. Mayor Joe Gunter. Here. Councilmember Cynthia Garfield. Here. Councilmember Jan Reimers. Here. You have a quorum.
Thank you. All right, next is the consent agenda. Is there any board member that would like to pull any item for discussion or question? Staff, did you want to, Michael, did you want to talk about the minutes? Was that a minutes correction?
Yes, Chair. There should be an item on everyone's desk, at least the voting members. It notes that there is a minor adjustment in the minutes. On the very first page, it indicates that Councilmember Kristen Clark was here on behalf of the City of Delray Oaks. That was actually Councilman John Gagliotti, and so the correction is before you already.
Thank you. Any member of the public? Oh, yes, Director Adams.
Thank you very much. I wanted to pull item 7E for comment.
7E. Okay.
This.
Great. Any member of the public wishing to pull any item for question or comment from the consent agenda? Okay. Let's see. Why don't we discover what your comment or
So my comment regarding the Habitat Conservation Plan update. In the background, the second line, it said the Fort Ord Reuse Authority, FORA, must complete an HCP for take of federally listed species. And my understanding is that that is a want and helpful, but it's not a must. The habitat management protection is a must, but I think this is simply a want.
All right. So must or want? That's the question. Okay. So when the board adopted the 1997 base reuse plan, there was Appendix A to the base reuse plan, and the base reuse plan EIR points to mitigations of getting take permits. At the time, it wasn't called an HCP; it was called an Hmp Implementing Agreement. That was the attachment to the 1997 base reuse plan. It would have allowed FORA and the jurisdictions, the permittees, to have permits for take of species on forward. So environmentally, there's a must. If that is unattainable, as this process is coming to its conclusion, then we'll have to deal with that situation. But the board has discretion in terms of how to get those permits.
So do you agree then that the word should remain is that we must complete this? Should it be we should? Should it be we might?
Can I, Director Adams, can I ask you a question? Are you making a distinction between it must be an HCP
Correct.
as opposed to we must do something about the environmental impacts?
That,
So,
yes.
yeah, okay. So the question is whether this seems to imply that it must be an HCP as opposed to an HMP or some other set of mechanisms.
Right. Yes. So yes, there are other options on the table, for certainly.
So, Chair, if there's a...
Yes.
So, I agree with Director Adams, is that we all understand there is an obligation for the habitat component going forward. And the HCP is one option. The HMP at this point is mandatory if you look at your transition plan and the contracts that you have asked all of us to review. My question, I had some questions about when on this page 15, I think it's page 15. 18, excuse me, where it says the funding is scalable. I wanted that explained. But secondly, it would seem to me that this item, we have a Hmp report coming up. So I would suggest that we reserve the questions so that there might be more of a dialogue of both items by compare and contrast. That will help all of us understand. That would be my suggestion. Do I need to make a motion to ask that this be considered with the report on the Hmp, which is a different item?
Yeah.
Just so that all of our questions can be addressed within the scope of that discussion.
I think that makes sense. I think I can just sort of in terms of agenda management say let's do that. So we'll trail 7E to the end of the business items, and so with that, I would entertain a motion to approve the remaining consent agenda items A, B, C, D, and F.
So moved.
Great, thank you. Moved by Gunter, seconded by Adams, if I may. Any further discussion?
Yes,
Yes.
we were going to add another item for Bill Camp. Would that be item G?
We did it
okay.
without giving it a number or anything. We
Okay.
were thank you, though, for making sure. Okay, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. That passes unanimously. All right, we will move to our business items. I will just say before we launch that it has been requested that we take 8E in advance of 8D because it may have some implications so the transition plan discussion may have some implications for the legislative committee report. And then within 8A, that we get the progress report before we discuss the habitat management plan. So anyway, that's been requested. I think it's reasonable. So I'll just try to keep track of which one we're on, and you can
So
correct
no
me if
motions required.
I don't think so. Council, we don't need a motion for,
So
If there's no objection of the board, I think
Right.
you could proceed, Chair.
okay. Great. Not seeing anyone looking too worried. Puzzled, yes. Worried, no. We'll allow that to go forward. Thank you. So the first thing that we are going to discuss is 8A, Regional Building Removal Feasibility Progress Report. Mr. Brinkman.
Chair Parker, members of the board, this item was before the administrative committee last fall, who recommended it to the board. The board made a decision last fall to fund and authorize the executive officer to select and enter into a contract with a financial consultant to look at the feasibility of doing building removal, the remaining regional building removal on the base. So this is a progress report on where we've been since then. So we issued an RFQ and we received 3 responses. One response was from Montague DeRose, another was from EPS, and a third was from NHA Advisors. We formed a selection committee to interview all 3 firms. The selection committee included the Seaside City Manager, interim finance director from City of Marina, and FORA staff. The selection was for NHA Advisors. And after selection, we began to work on the scope for NHA. We took that scope to the administrative committee in January and then entered into the contract. They've been working for since February of this year. So I'm going to cover a little bit of their scope and then into their schedule so the board can see what's on the horizon. So on the consultant's scope, they are scoped for 2 tasks. There's a 3rd task here, but is contingent on future board direction if the board so chooses. The first task item is about completing legal and financial feasibility analyses. These will be in the form of memos. And then the second task is to design a financial plan to remove the buildings. So these legal and financial feasibility memos will look at questions. On the legal side, they'll look at if FORA can legally issue bonds based on its property taxes, and it will also look at, after 2020, which entities would be responsible for making those bond payments, for managing the funds and overseeing this whole program of regional building removal. On the financial end, the second memo, the financial memo, will look at questions of what is the existing building removal liability, looking at different buckets by jurisdiction, what is the liability within each jurisdiction, what are the outcomes that jurisdictions would expect from this program, and what assets can each jurisdiction participate with in the program. I also look at what are the risks and the rewards that each jurisdiction would face in the program, and what is the potential of a market if FORA were to sell bonds to the open market. On the financial plan, their scope includes looking at a takedown program for the buildings. So there's 2 aspects to this. One is looking on the Dunes of Monterey project area. What is the potential remaining building removal on that site, and how could there be a program devised to take that down? And then a second component of that is all the remaining buildings within the program that are not currently under contract for building removal. I'd also look at a comparative analysis, looking at if each jurisdiction were to take on their own individual building removal liability, or if they were to participate in a conceptual plan where everyone chips in as part of the program to remove the buildings on the base. Their scope includes up to 2 meetings with the administrative committee to present their quantitative analysis, looking at that comparative analysis. Also to have 3 iterations of a draft financial plan and a final draft financial plan. So schedule, we have an aggressive schedule here. The feasibility analysis will be done in March, and then next comes the conceptual building removal business plan. We expect that to be in April. Comparative analysis will be April and May. The meetings of presenting quantitative analysis to the administrative committee would be April, May, and then the drafting of the financial plan would happen in May, and the final would be in June. So we're available if you have any questions about this progress report, and I'll turn back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Any board members? Yes, Director Morton with questions.
So, Jonathan, thank you. Your questions that you had, I believe the first section was feasibility, were very well articulated and laid out a structure by which the analysis needs to be made. Would you send this PowerPoint to the directors and also to our city managers? Because this analysis, Marina, Seaside, everybody that has blight will need to be doing their own analysis of these questions for that compare and contrast, the comparative analysis that you're expecting in April and May. So it's much easier for us to be prepared rather than trying to catch up.
Thank you. Any other board members with questions or comments on this item? Seeing none, any members of the public with questions or comments? Yes, please, Mr. Yount.
Yes, Doug Yount, Project Director for the Dunes Project. I think you had a, excuse me, one slide there that talked about the March 27th, I believe was the date for the feasibility analyses. It might make sense if it's possible to have that a little bit earlier available to everyone to review. I think that would be strategic, a better term. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other member of the public with on this item? All right, we'll close public comment and bring it back to this board. So there's no action needed on this, right? It's just an update. So great. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll move now to drones. And Josh gets to drone on, which he doesn't do. So good luck with that.
I'll talk fast.
Oh, he's going to dart. That's more like it. That's more like the Josh we know.
The dart fan.
Okay, Chair Parker, members of the board, thank you for the opportunity to be up here. Try not to drone on, but staying on target. I'm here today to present a program that evolved out of our early pursuit of an FAA special designation here for advanced drone development. And this program really represents, I think, a broadening of that scope and really a jobs growth focus for the region, and a real opportunity to align industry, academia, and government around this future potential. So if I can click here. So I will cover these topics today, and I just want to point out that we did get a request from Lane from the city of Marina, that just to point out that the city has yet to hear this and consider their participation in some of our proposed items at the end, and we will be bringing that to their council for consideration later. But we really think it's important for everyone here to be able to understand what we're talking about, because it is actually a regional program which has applications to our ag tech industry, our military retention efforts, and all the educational institutions and activity going on around the region. So as I've shown before, the drone market around the world is significant, in the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars and increasing. And these are just some graphs that kind of show the projections, and many industry watchers are already seeing these as underestimate. You know, for this one looks at the direct economic impact of the UAV industry in the United States up through 2025, up to $5 billion. This one looks at the U.S. commercial drone market through 2022 in the range of about $1 billion. And these colors talk about the different sectors that drone applications are being developed for. Media and entertainment's the red, the green is other, that's a large category. Government, including military, homeland security, is the largest. That's the gray. But perhaps quite relevant to our area, agriculture is over $100 million projected market by 2020. So this is the potential, the market potential that we as a region have the opportunity to participate in. It's not going to be forever, but as being a leader, we can establish ourselves and really seek to claim some of that for our communities, for jobs, and for the folks graduating our colleges and higher education institutions. So as I referred to earlier, we went after this, what's kind of a cumbersome acronym, UASIPP. We'll just call it the Uas Proposal, which was intended to establish the Marina Airport as a hub for innovation in integrating drones into the federal airspace. There were 10 sites selected around the country, and in California there was one site which went to the city of San Diego. There was about 250 applications from around the country, and at the FAA Drone Symposium that we attended in Baltimore last year, we heard from the FAA directors that to all the communities that were there advocating for their proposals, if you did not receive this designation, don't stop with your initiatives. You can pursue them and learn from these individual sites and continue that momentum. So we came back, and once the final decision was made, we decided to find a pivot for our initiative because we had brought together a really interesting group of public and private partners. And so what we're talking about today is our version 2.0, which is kind of framed up around this DART consortium idea, which would be including establishing world-class operations, being part of a national network, and really focusing on Monterey Bay as a regional center for innovation in this field. This is a picture that shows a bunch of logos of interesting institutions. You may find your own up there, hopefully, and businesses that were part of this coalition that formed around the initial UAS IPP application. Many of these companies down here on kind of the lower right quadrant you might be familiar with, including Joby Aviation, which has been really moving towards the potential of establishing a major new manufacturing facility here in our region, but also Precision Hawk, which is one of the largest drone services providers in the United States, and just recently acquired a local company, Inspect Tools, here, and has now set up operations in the Monterey Bay area and is performing a multi-million-dollar contract for PG&E, assessing the risk on all their power lines around the state. So that's currently ongoing. So this is just showing you that there's lots of activity in this area in our region already, not to mention, of course, all the stuff happening over at the Naval Postgraduate School, which is quite impressive the more I learn about it. But these were some of the advocates for the program. We had Congressman Panetta's direct involvement. We had a letter from our University of California president, Janet Napolitano. We had large companies advocating for our program, and all these folks continue to be supportive of this initiative going forward. So we've evolved this initiative to include not only drones, but automation and robotics, because that's so important to the agriculture industry, as well as autonomous vehicle development. I don't know if some of you may be aware, but we have a number of companies currently using roadways and space around the former base to do autonomous vehicle testing. Some of the biggest companies you read about are doing that around here. I get calls from them occasionally. So again, we see this as an opportunity to align industry, government, and academia towards realizing this potential. And so that's kind of what we're moving towards. One of the steps we've taken, understanding that FORA may be going away and not too far down the road, we formed a 501c3 organization as a durable vehicle to move this mission forward, connecting stakeholders, identifying, pursuing, and securing public and private funds, working with our educational institutions to facilitate education, especially with workforce opportunities. One of the things that's been really interesting so far is we've recognizing the potential for Joby landing here. We wanted to get in front of that, and we've worked with all the community colleges and also the colleges here to convene a workforce group to identify the jobs potential that that represents and make sure that we have a pipeline of talent being developed for that company and other companies like them. So we also would then advocate for safe, appropriate market facilities and airspace access. So we've identified a number of key building blocks. Communication with the community, we would need broad community engagement and support. The safety is paramount, so that underlines all activities, especially with drone activity. We need places to do stuff. We need research and development happening. We need capital and access to that, growth and establishment of markets, a strong workforce, a culture of innovation, and I think one of the interesting opportunities for California and for the Monterey Bay in particular is to build a body of expertise in the area of law, policy, and ethics regarding these applications. So we have built some momentum around this idea following workshop we put on at the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership State of the Region Conference last fall. We had a great convening of a number of interested folks. We want to keep that momentum going, so we've started a few things. One is a series of meetups. So who's familiar with a meetup? Anybody been to a meetup? Okay, so it's a thing. If you're into, millennials do it, but basically it brings people together around a common theme. So we did a meetup, the first one in February. We held it out at the UCM Best Center, and we said, hey, we're doing this drone automation robotics tech meetup. We had 70 people from all over the region come out, which included educators, investors, entrepreneurs, established companies, new companies, people looking for opportunities. And we had representatives from Joby Aviation talking about what they're up to. We had some other presentations, and it resulted in a number of new initiatives that are continuing. So we're doing these now every other month, and our next one will be April 16th with a focus on public safety. Now this is an area that's getting a lot of attention. A lot of fire departments, police departments, and search and rescue teams around the country are using these tools to improve efficiency and safety for their officers as well as the public. So we'll be talking about that, so we encourage you to join us if you want, or certainly spread the word to your network. We are working with UC Ag and Natural Resource Division to bring their 2019 drone camp here, and that'll be done in partnership with Cal State University Monterey Bay, UC Santa Cruz, and this UC Ag and Natural Resource Division. That'll be about 75 faculty, students, and agency professionals focused in the sort of natural resource management and agriculture application area doing training on drones. And then the end of that week, we're organizing what will be the first Monterey Bay DART Symposium. We want this to be a world-class event that will showcase some of our leadership in the region in this area, continue to elevate the spotlight on our region for this type of activity, and that'll be held at the Monterey Hyatt. So we have, in the mid-year budget, which you're all going to consider here in the next item or two, we've made a couple requests for adjustments to the approved budget. The first one would be to be the lead event sponsor, seed funding the DART Symposium for June 21st. These are some of the objectives, the target audience, and I think it would be a great opportunity for FORA to sort of catalyze this initiative forward and perhaps a parting gift as we transition into the future. The next, and this is really the item that will potentially involve direct participation and consideration by the Marina City Council. We have developed a Economic Development Administration grant proposal for feasibility studies in two areas. One is focused specifically on the question, is it feasible to conduct commercial drone operations at the Marina Airport? Now, this would be one of the leading sites in the country to take this on, and it would pave the way for significant new investment to occur. Now it builds directly from our earlier proposal, and as I mentioned, still needs to be considered by Marina, but the indication is that it has great potential. So this feasibility study would also include a second piece, which would be, this was recommended by our EDA representative. There's funding pools for workforce training and business incubator facilities through the EDA. So that would be the second piece that would provide for the pursuit of a capital grant from EDA that would pay for the construction of these buildings, and this would likely be located on either at or near the Marina Airport. We're talking about either Marina Airport property or UC MBEST property. So this is kind of how the grant budget lays out. Because you're sitting in what's called a federal opportunity zone. Who's heard of opportunity zones? Anyone? Yeah, so this is one of the biggest ones on the West Coast, certainly on the half a mile from the ocean, right here. It's about 3,000 acre area, census tract, shown by that green polygon over there. And it's a new condition that's really going to catalyze significant interest in development in this area. And because it's in the opportunity zone, federal agencies have been directed to make these even more attractive. And so rather than a normal 50-50 split, that is a federal grant with a local match, this grant would only require a 20% local match to an 80% federal contribution. So these are kind of the target ranges of the cost of these studies. It would be done through an RFP process, so that we would evaluate them on cost competitiveness, and we would include our partners at the City of Marina on that RFP process and everything. But what we're asking for is that because the establishment of these facilities at the Marina Airport and at UC MBEST would have significant regional value for business attraction and retention and business growth, jobs growth, that the board consider the $50,000 cash match and a $16,000 staff contribution towards that local match total. So we would gain $400,000 through a combined $100,000 local match amount. So that's what we're asking for in the budget adjustment that you're going to consider. And this here is a dartboard. We're going to be making these dartboards for little knick-knack gifts for later, but it is instructive because it describes many of the categories of kind of application of these technologies. So anyhow, I'm be glad to answer any questions, and I can say that it's pretty much day by day. I'm just impressed by the enthusiasm I'm seeing regionally and cross sectors. I today had a phone call from the Naval Postgraduate School, met with the CSUMB public safety people, talked to UC people, and it's just seems to have some real interest and enthusiasm. So I do hope that we can continue that momentum here. Thank you.
Yes, Chair and members of the board, just to close out on this comment, we're not specifically asking for any action on the request under this item. That's under the budget item later. But certainly if there's any questions about those, we'd be happy to answer. Second, often when Josh gets up and does these reports, it looks like he's doing 1,000 hours a month on each of these individual programs. This is just a small part of the overall effort that Josh has underway. He continues to work with UC MBEST on other options. He's working and providing the primary staff to the Central Coast marketing team. He's working on behalf of the county for other certain projects. So Josh has got a fairly full portfolio, but part of all of this effort is under that part of economic development. And the last thing is, in your board packet, what Josh had on the board had $16,000 in a staff time contribution. The board packet said 13. That really we readjusted that. Josh did that. It is correct because we moved the portion of Marina's down to kind of reflect the balance of the request.
Thank you. Board member questions and comments, Mr. Gagliotti. And then,
We start with, I'm very bullish on economic development, and I absolutely think that I can see very, very obvious opportunities for us in this region.
Would you hit your
But I'm also a pilot, and this area is very tight airspace.
Yeah.
We've got Charlie, Delta, Echo, Gulf, and then we've also got kind of marine bird sanctuary airspace areas around here that we as pilots have to look out for. So I have two questions. One is, what would be the airspace requirements for R&D or for operations out of Marina? Mm-hmm. And then two, what are some of kind of the broad categories within that feasibility study?
Yeah, okay. So, first of all, any activity would have to be fully compliant with FAA regulations, and so the big part of that study would be to assess what is possible in a very specific and detailed way. So the components of the study would look at infrastructure, what's the existing facilities, including radar and airspace management capabilities. So one of the things that let's see, oops, can we put that back up there? Sorry about that, Jen. There's an organization that we attracted the attention of with that initial FAA application. This logo for Grand Sky, their organization in Grand Forks, North Dakota, that's operating the country's first drone business park. And so they have established the capability to do flying around North Dakota. Obviously, it's wide open and much fewer people, but they're building out this national network of sites, and through our conversations with them, the discussion has centered on the potential to extend their tools. There's an airspace awareness system. It's a radar system with an information backend that could allow for these types of activities to happen here. So we would work with the industry and the regulators to define exactly where flights could happen, ensure they weren't conflicting with regional airport activity or any other air use. You know, the thing is, drone activity is happening, and as a pilot, you know that it's a concern nationwide and internationally. And so, you know, building awareness, maintaining a broad public awareness, and developing the protocols and practices for safe integration is necessary, basically. And this would be a contribution to that, as well as learning from the leading sites, these 10 sites around the country.
thank you. Mr. Lewis, and Director Hoffa, did you have a question?
Got answered.
It did. Okay, great. Thanks.
I just wanted to thank you and tell you that you know, we've heard from our science and other faculty, they really are behind this project, and any jobs that students may get in the future is just a plus for us.
Director Wizard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So while Director Gagliotti flies airplanes that hold people, I'm a commercial drone pilot, and so I have a little bit of information about this topic. And so one of the limitations is the inability to fly commercially, so for profit or in the furtherance of some enterprise, over people. And the way that Director Gagliotti described the various airspace, to make it easier to conceptualize, about 75% of Monterey County resides within controlled airspace. A very small portion resides without. And so I'm generally concerned with, you know, the breadth with which we could develop such a plan. But I appreciate the distinction between, you know, drones being out there and the prohibition of the government to enforce regulations upon amateur pilots, and the opportunity that exists in the commercial space with the limited airspace available outside of the control of air traffic controllers. So my question for Mr. Metz, after thanking you for your detailed presentation, is what You said something to the effect of this being one of the premier places in the country for the furtherance of this initiative, and I'm wondering what, beyond the opportunity zone, what would designate Marina
Make it so.
as the place.
Well, we're working hard to make it one of the places, and what we've been talking about from the beginning of this effort was a few key factors. The proximity to Silicon Valley is a big one, and the proximity to the ocean is another, and the proximity to the Salinas Valley is another. So those three key factors really make this premier site, combined with our existing rich military history, because I don't know if you're aware, but I mean the Naval Postgraduate School is among the national, international leaders in R&D development in this area, and they're right here in our backyard. So all of those factors make it to be kind of a very unique and opportunistic place. You know, we have been to some of these drone conferences, and the one in Baltimore in particular, hearing about the different sites that are being proposed around the country, and really none have that combination with all that comes along with being located in the West Coast and California, and the weather and the access to the financial world, the venture capital world, and all of those. So those are many of the strategic factors that make this a real great site for this to happen.
Director Morton?
Yes, so the expenditure of the total of $66,000 between cash and staff time, and the same is a portion is being asked from the city of Marina, and our city council has not considered that, so votes today by Mr. O'Connell are not a reflection of any action by the city. But the expenditure of those funds would be only if the grant is provided to us.
Right.
So it's not an investment in advance of getting the grant funds.
That's right. And there's no requirement even to accept the grant funds until we get a letter from the EDA saying we approve your grant, and here, sign on the dotted line to receive the funds.
So that's my point. Today is only one step in asking us to go forward to making the grant applications. But if we're granted, if that comes to us, we will again have the opportunity to accept the grant and to accept the responsibility for this matching funding.
That's right. And really, we have drafted so that there's a two-stage process in the grant application. One is an initial consideration by the EDA regional team, if this is one of the projects they want to fund. We've been lucky because we've developed a productive working relationship with our regional representative. That's not Maryland, it's Madeline. Melissa Madsen.
Melinda Madsen.
Melinda, there's a lot of M's going on. I'm sorry.
A lot of girls.
We have a Marilyn Lydiov in the city of Marina. That's why I get tangled up on that. So I apologize for that. Anyhow, we have a nice relationship with her, and she has actually reviewed this application a couple times in helping me get it straightened out. We've gotten feedback from a number of folks up at CSUMB and who have done grants like this before. So the indication is good, but indeed we would have to get that initial nod, do a final application. And part of that final application is a letter saying we've compiled the local match. So that's kind of why we're here now, along with your budget considerations today. So
may I ask the rest of my question?
Yeah.
So the feasibility study that would be funded through this grant and additional contributions would answer the questions that have been raised by Director Gagliotti and Wizard as to, is the Marina Airport truly a place where anybody would invest for this kind of project? So that's to get an answer. I just have one other observation, and is that your meetups that are the 6th to the 8th, which I'm sure if Marina is going to invest money, the third Tuesday of every month is City Council. So we will never be able to get staff or any other participants there as far as council members. So I would request that if you have any say, that that's the second or the fourth.
Great. Well, the good news is I've got lots of say because there's not too many people besides me that's messing around the meetup calendar. But we did get a request. The reason we chose that particular day is our friends at CSUMB who do the startup meetups. They asked us for that, but we can make an adjustment, and I will definitely try to make that happen so that we
So
can
thank you for giving Marina equal say to yours as to when those meetings will occur.
Absolutely. We'll make that some adjustments for sure. Thank
Director
you.
Phillips?
Thank you for your presentation. This is interesting stuff. But how much are we locked in on what we're doing with Marina if they don't go along with? Is that
That's a good question. There are other airports in the region, and I think there's one in Salinas so yes, indeed there are options. Being that my primary focus is the reuse of Fort Ord, Marina Airport has been the primary, but indeed there are options. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is the staff time for grant management, or is it in preparation for the document, or both? So if we were to be awarded the grant, would the grant management come out of the 16,000 and the 10,000?
It would come out of the grant. The grant, not, Josh, as I understand it, we probably will have to invest a bit more staff time in completing the application and negotiating it with EDA and working that whole process through with the city of Marina, but that's already part of this year's approved budget. This budget would finance the oversight of the consultant that would do all the technical work and the management and operations as well as the workforce component. So it would all come out of the grant.
Thank you.
Yes, you might be able to get a little savings on my time or something for FORA.
Any other questions from board members before I ask the public if they have any questions or comments? All right, I'll open it up to the public. Anyone wishing to make comments or raise questions on this issue? Proposal? Idea? Okay, we'll close public comment. Any further board comments before we move to our next item?
I'm going to speak on behalf of the Salinas Valley and the city of Salinas. If it turns out that Marina finds this not to be acceptable, we would like to be considered, and along with the city of Greenfield, which I have spoken to, who has an airport that is non-controlled, and we have spoken to our junior college who said they have a building right next door that has room for classrooms and for development. So there is other options if Fort Ord or Marina decides they don't want this. Thank you.
All right, the competition's on. Any other comments from directors? All right, thank you. Thanks so much for the update. We will move now to the mid-year budget.
Yes, Chair, I think staff have put together a rather solid presentation. I think Helen worked last night and she came by just so she could visit us. She's here every Friday, as you all know. Friday afternoons she comes just for board meetings, and Mayor Gunter said she's a brave woman. The budget this year, the mid-year budget, has been reviewed by the Finance Committee, and what you have before you is the recommendation by both the Finance Committee and the Executive Committee with respect to the one item that has a staff benefit. And so the mid-year budget is in your packet, shows some rather specific items. Helen helped me out a little bit because I can't read it over there, but if I remember correctly, it's roughly a $3 million shift in funds, and that's mostly because much of our funding for certain actions is going to be deferred to fiscal year 2020.
That is correct. So let's just go down the line items here. So the first item there on the variances, as you can see, is the $51,000 for the federal grants. And as we shift staffing, some of the expenses will decrease, so therefore the reimbursement from the grants will also decrease. So that was a net effect of about $51,000.
This is page 33 in your packet.
Yes.
And then in the investment, we when we prepared the budget for last back in May, we did not include the interest or the investment earnings on the Section 115 at that time until such time that we knew exactly what we were getting. So we are earning about 2.5% interest net of fees on that Section 115 trust, which is committed for the CalPERS retirement. So there's about $120,000 additional income projected for this year. As far as expenditures, salaries and benefits, obviously you're aware that we've had some staff change. Total savings of about $109,000, but that is offset by the $4,500 staff request for health insurance premium benefit adjustments. And then on the contractual services, we have about $360,000 increased funding. $150,000 of that was already pre-approved by the board prior to this mid-year budget presentation. The $150,000 pertains to financial consultant that was used for building removal and, can't remember, Jonathan, what was the $100,000? Oh, he's not here. Okay, so the $100,000 was for the, it's hard to say, biennial formulaic fee study and technical support, the TPIAs, that was approved back in January, recently approved in January. And then, of course, included in that line item is the $60,000 for the DART initiative, including the symposium, $50,000 for the grant and $10,000 for the symposium. And then also included in that line item is $150,000 as part of the transition plan, which requires the transportation study that was in part of the resolution that you passed for the transition plan. Then in capital projects, this is where the big it isn't really a savings, it's a deferral of the transportation contingency into FY 1920. So overall, we decreased our expenditures by about roughly $2.9 million, and our ending fund balance increased to $31.8 million. The last item that you see on here is right here on the bottom part where the CalPERS termination is. The board has authorized about $1 million in reserve. We have funded $5.7 million already into PARS, and the staff and the finance committee has recommended that we invest the additional $1 million that the board has already set aside as a reserve into PARS so that we can earn additional investment earnings. Okay. So here's a more easier breakdown. It specifically itemizes the increases and the decreases. As you can see, the overall savings in salaries and benefits is $105,000. We have the $150,000 for the prior approved, board-approved financial consultant for building removal and other CIP project. And we have the $150,000 in the transition plan, and then we have the 3.1 decrease in the transportation contingency, which is being deferred to FY 2020, and then the $60,000 for the grant match. This is where we are asking the board to approve the increase in benefits for the staff. As you can see, it's net effect of about $4,500. This was the original budget included a 5% increase. However, the actual increase when CalPERS sent us the invoice was 6%, so it's roughly a 1% increase over what was originally budgeted. So the net effect is about $4,500. Overall, the effect of the staffing adjustments and this benefit adjustment is a savings of about $104,000. So again, the other items that we're requesting is to fund the $1 million pre-approved board reserve into the Section 115 trust. And so actions we're requesting today is the approval of the additional expenditures for FY 18-19, the $60,000 grant, DART initiative grant and symposium, the $150,000 for the transportation study, and secondly, to approve the health benefit increase adjustment with the $4,500 fiscal impact, and to authorize us to go ahead and fund the $1 million current reserve into the Section 115, and lastly, to adopt the 18-19 mid-year budget as recommended by the Finance Committee.
Thank you. Any questions from board members at this point? Yes, Director Morton.
So the transportation study as a part of the transition plan, I understand that was in the December 2018 transition plan, but I also, having attended the admin committee working meeting this last Wednesday, that transportation is being looked at within that committee structure and some additional analysis. Is it feasible to approve the budget? Can we approve the budget and vote separately on that transportation, or delay the expenditure of that money for transportation until it works through the admin committee, which my understanding is they are addressing transportation on March 20th?
I'm going to ask Jonathan for a little help with this, because I thought some of our work on identifying this would inform the administrative committee's deliberations. So I need to ask Jonathan for a little help.
Yeah, I believe the two go hand in hand. So part of the transition plan says to do the study to inform the final year CIP. And so part of the transition, what they're looking at is in parallel to this 1920 FORA CIP. So this information would hopefully be there for the administrative committee as they look at making decisions, making recommendations to the board.
So in follow-up, that approving the budget is not necessarily approving the expenditure. If the consultants that are working with the admin committee are indicative, they went through a criteria by which they were going to be analyzing the CIP, and in particular the transportation. If in fact those consultants through the admin committee would identify this study is not necessary, we would still be able to take action to not invest this $150,000, even if
Your executive officer would stop.
That's what I'm trying to figure out, because obviously we're trying to accumulate funds to put up for LAFCO, to put up for so many obligations we have.
Yeah, Chair, I think you can. So we have 15 months, 23 days, in a few hours.
I know.
I don't expect, and I'll probably make this comment again later, I don't expect that to be a totally smooth path, but throughout that path, whatever barriers are in the middle, there's going to be checkpoints and stop points, and we have to make sure that when we get to one of those, we stop the bleeding. So that's going to be the process throughout the next 15 months, 23 days, and a few hours.
And just to state, that is the point of this discussion, is to make sure that we are all in consideration of that approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other directors with questions on the mid-year budget? Any member of the public wanting to comment or ask a question on this? All right, I'll bring it back to the board. This does require action, so motion by Gunter, second by Carbone. Any further discussion by the board? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. Passes. I did. Passes unanimously. So now we will move to our transition plan update, and we will hear from the staff, I believe, on the 2018 transition plan, and then we'll get an update from the facilitators on their progress. And Mr. Hulamard will start us off.
Yes, Chair and members of the board, just a few moments ago I mentioned that we have about 15 months, 23 days, and a few hours to go. So I think this is an appropriate lead-in. The board approved the 2018 transition plan just a couple of months ago, and since that time, we have had an extraordinary amount of progress and activity in working with our colleagues from LAFCO, who neither could be here today because both are ill, but we've had very regular participation from council for LAFCO as well as the individual staff at LAFCO in trying to get through each of the individual components that's going to make up the 2018 transition plan, which included in that transition plan are individual agreements that parts of what the Fort Ord Reuse Authority currently do will be taken on by someone else, and that'll be an agreement between FORA and an entity. There are others that are between entities that are FORA members. There are other elements of that that might require a legislative adjustment or a fix, and we've worked very closely with Senator Monning's office, and they've asked us for some specific language on those items at some point in time. That's a matter of another item on the agenda in a few minutes. Today, we're going to get an overview from Sherry on the kind of activities we're doing, both with our staffing as it constrains. We've lost several staff. We're not adding new staff. We're moving things around to keep the costs as constrained as we can. And you'll also get a report from Kendall Flint, who's part of the team of Kendall and Steve Flint, who've been working to get as much information as they can in the very near term to be able to provide some recommendations, and mostly to provide direct negotiating help between agencies and or FORA and agencies to get agreements on board so that the next 15 months, 23 days, and a few hours is at least as barrier-free as we can make it. So I think Sherry will open up her comments, and I think she'll introduce Kendall, and then I have a few comments to make after Kendall is completed.
All right, great. Thank you, Chair Parker, members of the board, Sherry Damon, Risk Manager, Prevailing Wage Coordinator. Quick report, probably one of the shorter reports that I have ever given, my part of this report. I'm going to talk about the FORA staff activities. That's what we're calling that. There's a lot of things, as you know, in the transition plan that FORA inside the house, that's what I'm going to call it, has to do in order to implement and make sure things keep moving forward to wrap up smoothly. And so I'm going to start that report, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kendall Flint for the facilitator update and the next steps. So your FORA staff has not been sitting on their hands during the last month. We facilitated a Army Regulator Special Council meeting. It talked about the property transfer process, the easement process, how we find those things and clean up and make sure that those little hiccupy things that always seem to come out when the pressure is on, how we take care of those prior to June 30th, 2020, and have processes in place. We also had representatives from the County of Monterey and the City of Seaside at those meetings to talk about and learn about the Administrative Order on Consent, the ESCA process, and to meet the regulators and the folks from Washington. So that was a very successful meeting. It took almost a whole week, a lot of preparation and coordination, and we'd like to thank both inside the FORA staff members who did that, the people in the Army and the regulators who made that happen. A very successful meeting. Additionally, we are continuing with the human resources part of the downsizing the transition. And last month, you authorized the executive officer to move forward with a set of recommendations. Those recommendations have begun to be implemented, and they are being rolled out during this month and next couple of months. We expect to see more of that culminating, I think, by June-ish, certainly before July 1st as part of your next budgetary cycle, a recommendation on the downsizing/retention part of what your FORA staff, what your organization is going to look like moving forward during that last critical year of, 15 months, 23 hours, and maybe a few seconds, something like that. What is it? Who is going to be doing what? How are we going to get done all of the things that need to be done with the resources we have available? And finally, Keeping the pressure on CalPERS to provide that actuarial analysis is an essential part to inform this board, both in terms of its last year budget, in terms of the financial planning, so that we know what kinds of terminated agency liabilities are out there that may not yet be funded. CalPERS gave us some, it was a little rough and rocky start, as I reported to you last month. We had to do the noticing provisions of a brand new law that went into effect to notice all employees, both current and past, that we were taking action to move forward with terminating the CalPERS contract. That was not without some hiccups, but it happened. So rest assured, we have completed step one. And now we're just keeping the pressure on. We understand it's 90 days to get this actuarial, at least the first cut, and then I anticipate there will be some kind of negotiation process and maybe refinement of that analysis as we keep moving forward. But we are monitoring it. We expect it by mid-April, and we will keep you posted on when we get it. You will be some of the first to know. And that concludes my part. Kendall, over to you.
I would like to point out I was not actually wounded as part of this particular effort, although some people thought I might be. Anyway, again, I'm Kendall Flint with Regional Government Services, and I wanted to basically just walk you through what my colleagues and I have been working on for the past several months, and also bring you up to speed for some of the things that we've come up with thus far. I do want to make it really clear, though, that this is informational only today, and we still have a ton of work to do moving forward with some additional folks. Thus far, we've been able to meet with all of the city managers, administrators, and the county administrator, which has been incredibly helpful to us. We've also reached out to some of the members of the board. We hope to get through everyone within a reasonable period of time. We've been meeting with a number of the ex officio members as well. And this would include TAMC and some of the other folks out there. The reason we're doing that really is to get as much of a sense as quickly as possible about sort of where everybody's at. I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone in this room. There are very different of opinion about how we're going to get through this 13 months and change or 15 months and change. And it's very interesting walking into a group of folks who have already established relationships. And everyone kind of wants to tell you about, well, you know, they're really cool, but over here, a little dicey. So we've been going through all of that. And I got to tell you, the thing that I want to share with you all, we really do see a path to success. So one of the things that we thought was really interesting is that after we kind of got through a lot of this, there really is a lot of commonality, and there are some abilities for us, I think, to close some of these gaps. In addition to that, our work cannot be done in a vacuum. So while we're working very closely with the FORA staff, we're also connecting with our colleagues at DDA with regard to the Habitat Conservation Plan. We're talking with the folks that are working on the building demolition, building removals. Our other half at RGS is working on the employee transition. And of course, we're also looking at, you know, just various other financial impacts. Because again, not surprising, most everyone in this room is very concerned about the financial impacts of FORA's departure and how you're going to implement the base reuse plan and limit liabilities moving forward to make sure that that's going to work well. So I'm going to walk you through some of the key issues that we've identified to this point, and then also kind of bring you up to speed on what came out of the most recent admin committee meeting. And I think that was a really good opportunity for us to have a very frank discussion with the folks involved. Our mandate, I want to be very clear about this, we were asked to facilitate the transition that will end FORA. So everything I'm going to go through today is about FORA being gone, terminated as of June 30th of 2020. That being said, there still has to be a managed way to get funds through something to move out to fund habitat and other things that this group wants to see moving forward. The most likely scenario that came out of what we've seen thus far, and also is pretty much agreed on at the admin committee meeting, is some sort of a successor agency that may be legislatively set up with a very limited membership of 5 cities, and then of course Cal State University Monterey Bay. So this is not FORA staff, but rather individuals in this room that would make up that oversight committee. And those folks would then be tasked with looking at the funds that come in through whatever mechanism comes up, and I'll get to that in a moment. The alternative to that would be some sort of a locally formed group that might be something like a joint powers authority, but again, the idea is just finding a structure that will work and accomplish what this group wants it to do without extending FORA's lifetime. In that whole position, one of the things you'll see capped in here is no new projects and programs. In other words, this is simply a mechanism to get funding through to fulfillment of the reuse plan and also to pay for a lot of that habitat conservation. Now, when we look at the CFD, which is currently funding operations, now that is also something that was set up legislatively. It's different than a straight, like a nexus study. It's basically a group a calculation, if you will, of funds that are currently used for transportation and all these other things. The admin committee, and this is also true of my meetings with the staff at all the jurisdictions, seem to favor, at least at this point, the use of those funds moving forward for habitat and potential litigation that might be associated with FORA going away. There didn't seem to be support, again, this is post-FORA, after FORA, of taking funds in for transportation or other types of projects, with the idea being that when FORA sunsets, that those responsibilities for building those new roadways, new whatever that might be, would flow to the member agencies and the local jurisdictions and would be paid for through local impact fees or regional impact fees that might be negotiated. I think this one piece of it was the caveat on that, of course, is taking a look at some of these FORA projects that have the ability to be completed in this last cycle, and there's a handful of these projects that I want to chat with you about here. Now, this is really talking about what we're seeing in the capital improvement program. Right now, there's about half a dozen projects that are under FORA's control, one of them as an example being South Boundary Road. So the idea here is on the 20th, the admin committee, along with others, TAMC and whatnot, will be exploring and looking at these different projects and then correlating them with those that are requirements of the environmental impact report that was put together for the or reuse plan, right? So some things are, shoulds, some things are shall, so we want to make sure it's in compliance. Then the idea here is for the individual agencies to take on those projects post-FORA that they will then pay for in their own communities through impact fees or other means of funding. Now, the interesting thing about this that we want to just make sure we're all clear on is that there's going to be a lag at some point, and this is one of the things we talked about at the admin committee. So with FORA going away in 2020, for agencies, local agencies, to set up legally defensible fee studies or impact fee structures, there may be a bit of a push there. So there may be a reason to have that take effect a little bit later, perhaps in 2021 in terms of the CFD. It's too early to tell, but you can't just put a fee in place tomorrow. It does take some time to be able to structure that. But the idea is we're going to be talking about that. TAMC is going to be looking at the way their fees are structured. And I think the other concern we got specifically from the City of Monterey is making sure that when these fees and the things that go through CFD are concluded, that we're not double dipping and we're not creating an environment that is less economically desirable for people to come and invest in the county. So I think the way we kind of phrased it is that in a traditional Mello-Roos, if you're paying for roadway improvement projects in your neighborhood, you don't then pass another tax for roadway improvement projects for the same thing. So we want to make sure that we're being, fair and defensible. So this will be coming up at the, again, March 20th meeting, and then I expect that we'll be back next month to give this board an update about that. And then all of that discussion, you're still in the position of FORA putting together its capital CIP for the 2019-2020 year. But the idea here then is it will probably be a more compact list because we're looking at that next phase, right? So these two things are going to be coordinated, so when they come back and when you're looking at the CIP for that next fiscal year, It'll be informed by this discussion, which again has the compare and contrast of things that are environmentally required by legal and also things that can be funded realistically within this time frame. And I think that was one of the things we also heard from the members. They do want to make sure that these projects like South Boundary can happen, and then some of the others may have to move into, again, a future category or again to the local agencies. Now, this was a really interesting thing, and I really have to shout out to Steve. In fact, Michael asked me today, is Steve going to talk today? And I said, well, with so many people, we want to try to keep it clean. But just to point out, Steve's got over 40 years in planning, environmental, and basically looking at community development. And he's been working with the County of Monterey, and one of the things that we thought would be really important, a lot of the folks we spoke to expressed a concern post-FORA about how this region would handle affordable housing and housing in general. And the idea here was, how do you do that and make it work? San Mateo County came up with a really unique way to work with HCD, which basically says, let's get a sub-region declared, and then let's work collaboratively with all of the cities that are engaged in creating a housing element that will be cheaper to produce because it can actually have shared costs between the member jurisdictions, and also allows for a little more flexibility in terms of the actual placement of affordable housing and housing in general. Most of the jurisdictions seem to be extremely interested in that. We've reached out to AMBAG to see if we can facilitate that with them and kind of what that would look like. And then one of the questions we had and we're continuing to explore is that something that would happen county-wide or only within the cities that are currently within FORA? There's advantages both ways, but again, there's a lot of flexibility that can come out of that. And I think many of you know, not all of our jurisdictions are currently compliant with housing elements. And our governor has made it clear that he's not going to waste time in sending love letters that encourage you to get in compliance. So this is a way we felt we can address the regional needs of the area and really come out of it with a win for some of our other communities. Now, water is the other one. Not surprising. Like the movie Chinatown, water seems to be the big thing around here. And depending on who you talk to, we've spoken with environmental groups, we've met with the land watch people, we've met with the jurisdictions, we've met with the water district. And oddly enough, they don't all have the same opinion about water. So a couple things here. One, we have already working with Marina Coast Water District. They have assured us that with the agreements they'll be giving to the individual jurisdictions, that they will guarantee the delivery of water, acre-feet of water that is described in the base reuse plan. In the current agreement, it basically only takes that up to FORA, that if FORA goes away, that agreement goes away. And they're saying, no, we're on board, we're going to stick with that. Which then comes to the part two, well, do they have the water? We believe that they do. They're going to have a presentation on April 3rd at the admin committee, and they're going to be talking about the water that is available, how that's going to be distributed, and also bringing folks up to speed on potential for augmented water, which is why we also have invited Monterey 1 to participate. And again, we'll come back to the board with an update about that. We will be addressing water because we do know, obviously, there's going to be an attachment to that and any future development and implementation. Our other role in this process is really working with the local agencies to help facilitate these agreements between agencies, agreements between combinations of agencies, to find a way that everyone can feel comfortable with the transition plan and ensure that their constituents, their land, and their basic ideas of how this should work out is protected. I've mentioned to all of the city managers and administrators, and I think most of the folks I've spoken with, when negotiating these types of agreements, we're going to equally make people happy and sad, and that's kind of how it goes. I think the exec director mentioned a great Rolling Stones song to me today. You can't always get what you want, but you might just get what you need. So we're playing that song often and for the next several months, that's our goal. And so we're going to continue to do that. I think one of the other things that we're going to do is working closely with FORA staff, especially Sherry. It's become clear with so many versions. That's one of the things when we first started with this, there's hundreds of documents and agreements. And unless you are just nuts, no one can possibly grasp all of that at the same time. So we're suggesting, and I think we're going to be doing, summary documents, abstract memo, whatever you want to call it, but basically describing the highlights of these agreements so that when you all get them, before you send them off to council, which you must do for review, you can have a sense about just the highlights of what we're talking about. We also think that's really important for members of the public because, again, Not everybody goes to law school. We want to make it clean and clear so people know generally what's going on. This does not take the place, obviously, of reviewing those legal documents, but something that really should be helpful. These would also, of course, will be continuing to help facilitate these agreements and, of course, working with all the various committees. Now, in the coming months, we're going to continue with our work with FORA and all the member agencies. We're also going to be updating the contract lists and the agreements that we think we can see coming down the pipe, like what needs to happen, and make sure that those are intact and that those are being pursued. The other part of this in the next phase is really coordinating more with the stakeholders in the area, beyond just our electeds and the jurisdictions. This would also include economic interests, continuing relationships with basically the colleges and education, certainly veterans, veterans affairs, economic development, travel tourism, all these other folks, as well as environmental groups. As I mentioned previously, we'll continue to collaborate with other consultants so that, again, we're not siloing these different things. This is a complicated, a lot of things cross over to other places, so it's super important that we're really in deep in all of it so that we make sure that we're not going down one path that's not going to be compatible with another. And then finally, we'll also, of course, be coming back to the board on a regular basis and these various committees to give updates and whatnot. That really concludes my presentation for today. I'm going to pass it back to Michael, but I think you can get a sense. We feel like we've actually gotten quite a bit done in this period of time. We've been with you for 2 months, but there's still a long way to go. So again, we ask for your patience, and just to reiterate, also your frankness. I think that was something we tried to mention. It doesn't help us as facilitators if you don't tell us everything and be brutally honest, because if we don't have that kind of knowledge, we can't get to the heart of the problem and hopefully be able to negotiate some sort of a conclusion that will be advantageous for all. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and I hand it back to Michael.
Thank you, Kendall, and thank you for that thorough presentation. I did appreciate that point that you made to make sure to make reference to Sherry and I being nuts. I appreciate that. Well-stated comment, I would say. I wanted to point out just a few things because clearly Steve and Kendall have been able to get their arms around an awful lot in less than 2 months. And understand this, RGS, we weren't sure that we were going to have anybody who would do this, and a number of consultants turned us down and said we can't do it. We couldn't get ready to do it inside of 6 to 8 months. And Kendall and Steve have taken this on. They've had some experience in doing similar things, and they've become, as you can tell, Kendall is shy and retiring. That idea of being full and frank is something she is with us, and will be with you, and she's hoping to get the same out of you. So they've grasped stuff that takes many of the rest of us 6 to 8 months to do, drinking from that fire hose when you get into FORA and try to have to wrap all of that together. And so I'm very happy that we are able to have facilitators that can work on that. There's still quite a bit of work to be done before we're going to get real solid recommendations. There's still more work to give to the administrative committee who wants to see what the implications are of taking this out or moving this in or getting that around. So we still have some pieces to go. We're going to be meeting with our colleagues from TAMC. The city managers are heavily engaged in the process. Our legislators are heavily engaged in the process. And so I think what you're going to be seeing over the next coming months are the blossoming of the details where Judge Phillips always tells me is where the devil is. So today you're getting an overview that's a one of progress, certainly some major steps forward, but some big steps yet to go. So Chair, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Any questions from board members at this point? Director Adams.
Just a quick question. Thank you so much for the excellent report. It was really great. It was very comprehensive and very understandable. And I'm just wondering if we could have the PowerPoint posted someplace or whatever so that we could use it in. And is this information free for us to share with others who are asking about how we're doing and where we're going?
It's all public, and both of the presentations, Sherry's and Kendall's, will be on the web, on the FORA website.
Director Gagliotti?
So I unfortunately will not be able to attend the admin meeting on the 20th, which is, that's when the prioritization of the CIP is starting. Is that would be the first foray into that?
I think there'll definitely be several other meetings post on the 20th, but I think the 20th, what we're really trying to do is have a discussion about what kind of criteria we should be using for prioritizing those projects moving forward. But I don't believe that there will be a decision made on which projects specifically they would be at that time. And that's largely because we also have to go back and take a look at the costs of those. We need to circle back with Public Works and kind of figure out where we are in terms of their processes in general. So you'll definitely have another shot at it. I'm guessing probably at either the 27th or even the next meeting after that.
Okay, and then could you give me some detail on how that process is going to go through specifically? I mean, I think you
Sure.
know where my issue is of course south boundary. I can't see you.
There are six. I'm sorry, we keep going like this.
Yeah, I know.
There are 6 projects that are currently listed on this in the CIP that are FORA projects, right? We'll look at each of those 6, the total cost of what that completion would be, what's currently programmed in the CIP, and then we'll evaluate also the viability of are they buildable? And that's a discussion that should be spirited.
Yeah.
What I can tell you is from speaking with, just in general, Boundary Road appears to be one of the projects that it's so far down the road, it's so far ahead, I would find it highly unlikely that would not be included. I would think that's going to happen, but that's not my decision to make. That's certainly at this point, preliminarily, our recommendation, and there's a couple others, but that will be what we're looking at. And again, the EIRs has some general language about,
that's,
that sort of other stuff.
I don't think that's going to be.
It's not going to help us. It's going to be the dollar amounts, right? It's going to be the dollar amounts when the money comes in. And I think the other thing, which, because you were at that last meeting,
right.
One of the things, and again, really preliminarily, I just want to make sure we're all clear on that. One of the things that potentially, if the member agencies are not able to get their impact fees in place, by June 2020, which is faster than you think, right? If we extended that CFD as is for another year, there might even be another year of funding for some of those projects. That's something else we would be talking about down the road.
Yeah, so that actually brings up, so the CFD until closure still will include these, what I would call the interim projects, or these 6 projects.
Correct.
That is correct.
Correct. Yeah, and I think, again, Steve Ansley and I were speaking about this earlier today. Your CIP process still has to happen. You still have to complete that out.
I wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, so just even though FORA is sunsetting, that does not preclude, or actually you must still come up with a CIP for that last year.
Right.
And in some cases, that's why we want to kind of lay it out that way. In some cases, the actual construction may not complete by June 2020. It might move into 2020, late 3rd or 4th quarter, even 2021.
Right.
But we can plan for those things and then make the adjustments appropriate in order to fulfill those obligations.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions by board members? Yes, Director Morton.
So when you went through about the CFD continuing, and I want to be sure I understood correctly, is there options, be it legislative extension versus these agreements that the jurisdictions would enter into?
Yes. So I want to be clear on 2 things, because this also came up in the meeting. There's a legislative requirement for the Habitat Conservation Plan, which involves actually 14 agencies. Is anybody that's got a touch on it. And that would be a JPA. Those folks would be responsible for implementing, making sure that the habitat happens. So that is over here in another place. But the CFD is one of several, or basically 2 options you have in terms of continuing a funding source. So currently, and this is just our preliminary look at it, without extending FORA staff, FORA board, any of that, because it's already built, it would be a little bit easier, we think, and seamless to just extend that, change the scope of the CFD to reflect what the board's wishes are in terms of what it will fund, adjust that funding as dictated by that, right, and then go on. The alternative to that would be forming a new Joint Powers Authority, which would still be the same members, the same 5 cities and the 4 cities, the county, and the college, but it would be a new thing. So the one is already set up. We just have to make adjustment. The other we'd have to set up from scratch. That would be the local fix. One of those two things would need to happen because you have to have a body that is capable of taking money in from these impact fees, and it can't just be like a nonprofit. It has to actually be legislatively, or sorry, an agency of a type.
A JPA or a legislatively created body.
Correct. Or say in this case, it would be legislatively extended. So the CFD, as it exists today, would change its scope if that's the board's pleasure. So it would be environmental, whatever that might be. Other things, as an example, you might consider that you want to extend funding to Monterey Salinas Transit. These are some other things we'll be talking about on the 20th. But whatever the board's desire is at that point, it could be adjusted and conform to that. And then that extends without FORA staff, without this board. It becomes just a nice, tight little package, which is overseen only from a financial standpoint by the the 6 members that would sit on that oversight. They would not do new projects. They would not, do other things. It would simply be oversight of the fund itself, and then distribution of those funds theoretically to the JPA that's being formed for the habitat conservation.
So the participants would be those that were contributing actual CFD funds solely.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I did have a couple of questions. One related to the CFD. Are you suggesting that jurisdictions start now to establish their own CFD for the future projects? What was that?
So if you're not in FORA, elsewhere, right? So what happens is individual jurisdictions, these are largely, cities, county, they would have developer impact fees. And the impact fees in those cases are usually based on a nexus, which is different than this, right? So most of the time, if that's the way we're going to go, then the individual jurisdictions at this point would go out RFP to have someone construct that for you. And that would be based on what it actually is going to cost for all these other things going forward. Now that takes care of your local, right? Some counties set up, in addition to, like TAMSI has regional fees, right? There are also regional fees that some counties set up on top of these other things. So one of our discussions is the idea that we would want to work with TAMSI and with the admin staff to find out what is the best combination of those. What you're really trying to do is identify an alternative funding source to CFD. But if the board's wish is to continue funding transportation, you could do that. I can only tell you that at the admin committee level, that was not favored.
Okay, I think I see. The question I had in reading your report and then also listening to your presentation was, I know that the transition plan and LAFCO are kind of thinking that the essential agreements between the jurisdictions will be in place, at least pretty complete drafts by the end of the summer. Are you looking at, does that look like the timeline that you're working on?
I think that there's different agreements, and I think that from our standpoint, we're hoping that we have those by late summer, early fall, because you need enough time in order to get them through all the different councils and the county, right, for approval. There are some other agreements that might be looked at that might take a little bit longer, but the base ones, we're hoping at the next meeting actually that we'll have that matrix to kind of review again and say, here's what we're thinking. But we know, as an example, making it simple, water, we know that Marina Coast Water District is prepared to put together those agreements between it and those agencies regarding the will serves. If there are other types of transportation projects, for example, that someone wants to get into post FORA, that might take a little bit more time. But yes, that's the idea, is to have them completed so that we spend the first 2 quarters of 2020 approving those and we have a seamless transition.
Thank you. Very helpful. I will just mention that it has been reported to me that the PowerPoints, this one and Sherry's, are online now. So, yeah. No waiting. So if there are no further board questions at this point, I'm going to open it up to the public. So are there any members of the public who would like to comment or ask a question on these updates?
One of the way back to '94 today. Who are the? On one of your slides, you had a proposed extension of FORA. How many? I remember there used to be a thing called the Forward Economic Development Agency, which is the precursor to FORA, and the only reason it became FORA is that Henry Mello and a couple of other, couple of mayors had a go-around, and as a result of that, no offense, PG, Carmel, and Salinas, they have no issue whatsoever. They have nothing to do with the Fort Ord Reuse Authority. It was Henry Mello was all upset, and he made sure everybody in the world had a say-so. Sand City, the original Fort Ord Economic Development Agency, were the 5 cities, Seaside, Marina, Monterey, Delray Oaks, and 1 supervisor. The only reason we had 1 supervisor is that the city of Monterey had a representative, and if we use county members, you will have 2 members from District 5, no offense, Mary, on this board. So I would caution is to take a look at what there used to be there and how it worked. Judge Phillips would not be here if he was FOIA, and Sand City has no longer has any opportunity. So I would sit down and really work with the other cities to find out who you want on this.
So just to your, if I understood this correctly, I want to make sure I'm clear. The only thing that would extend past 2020 would be specific to the CFD.
Okay.
And it only has Seaside, Marina, Delray Oaks, Monterey, County, and
How many county?
one of each.
Okay, I can live with that.
And and of course, and then Cal State Monterey Bay. So again, but again,
because
this is
of the CFD. You're including CSUMB.
correct.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm happy. Thank you.
One happy at a time. Yay.
Great. Any other members of the public with comments or questions on this? All right, we'll close public comment. Are there any other board comments or questions? Yes, Director Adams.
Can you just remind me why Cal State Monterey Bay is included in that mix?
Cal State Monterey Bay had requested participating from some time ago. The only reason why Cal State and UC were not involved is because the attorneys at University of California kicked them off of the original FORA board. And I think you heard Eduardo Ochoa when he was here before. He had requested the participation. They are probably at least an equal landowner in terms of development of the other development entities on the base. I think they have 1,320 acres of property, and pretty much all of it is going to be the campus in the future. So they had requested it. This is a decision that needs to be made by the legislature or the board or who the members are. So it's a recommendation, and I'm glad you asked the question, because all of this that Kendall and Steve are presenting at this point are very preliminary items. We still don't have numbers attached to them. We don't know what the impacts are. There's been all kinds of questions about the weighted potential voting. Does the county lose if they only have 1 vote? There's a lot of questions that have popped up that need further exploration. This is really just preliminary. This is not something final today.
Director Morton.
So the CSUMB question comes up. Yes, I understand they have land, but the land is within the city confines of Seaside, within the city confines of Marina, within county also. So what is the reason I'm questioning is because CSUMB is not governed by the regional base reuse plan. They are exempt from the imposition of meeting the requirements of the reuse plan and meeting the mitigations. So it's difficult for me to give a vote unless you're going to participate fully participate, and that all of your decisions would also be compliant with the regional plans, that you subject yourself to that oversight. And then the question that I have, based on your rationale just given, Mr. Hulamard, is, well, then why wouldn't TAMSI be on this board? Is they're not governed by the regional plan, but their regional roads have probably more impact than just owning land. So I challenge the thinking, not that I'm making a decision or a recommendation, but I'm asking for all of us to think about truly what is the applicable criteria, other than I want to raise my hand and say I want to participate. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, Director Garfield.
Thank you. I think Director Morton gives us a preview of how complex these issues are and how much that needs to be considered. So all I'm saying is I want to give you guys a compliment, a huge compliment about what you've been able to get momentum going and keep the balls in the air and make progress and appear to be hale and hearty except for whatever happened to your foot. Really much appreciated energy you've added to this. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Any other comments before we move to the Habitat Management Plan analysis thing? All right, thank you very much for the update, the information. So we will move now to Habitat Management Plan responsibility analysis.
So, Chair, we are combining this with the earlier item from the consent agenda, and Mary Israel and Jonathan Brinkman will give you a presentation. We had originally, at the thinking that the status report was going to be less of concern, had put that on the consent agenda, but I think if you could, Mary, give us a little bit of a status update to kind of, okay?
Okay, hello. Let me get this a little taller. Hi everyone, I'm Mary Israel, Associate Planner for FORA, and I greet the chair and the members of the board with a happy International Women's Day. Yes. Yeah! So here's a brief update on the Habitat Conservation Plan that I'm going to call the HCP for the rest of the day. The Habitat Conservation Plan is on track for a record of decision and base-wide incidental take permit issuance within the year. The public draft will be released in just a couple of months. Please refer to the HCP schedule, which is in the consent agenda section of today's packet, for details. Here's the Hcp Funding Overview. Hcp preparation and environmental review has been paid for by FORA using CFD special taxes, as you've heard discussed at length today. They're collected from former FORA development, and CFD funds are earmarked to start the Hcp endowments. CFD funds were decided to be used for this purpose since securing base-wide ITPs enables development on the parcels that were assessed fees. The Hcp endowments were originally projected to be $9 million, but are now expected to cost $48 to $66 million. The service, and that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the state, which is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, added requirements for permits, and new species were listed. So the cost of meeting those requirements were costed out. By the time FORA sunsets, about $21 million is expected to have been collected for this use. The jurisdictions need to figure out how to generate the remaining 27 to 45 million required. And it sounds like you're already having some good discussions along those lines. Alternatively, the state legislature might extend FORA's financing ability. So I'd like to roll right into the Habitat Management Plan responsibilities analysis, and we can go to a HCP, HMP discussion after the full presentation, if that's all right with the chair. Okay. Although the FORA board took action on October 12, 2018 to move the HCP ahead as FORA's habitat conservation planning effort, and the project is on schedule for setup within the year, the motion included direction to report back with additional information on jurisdictions' installation-wide multi-species habitat management plan, we will call the HMP, responsibilities and projections of the cost of implementing the HMP. There was interest in more information about an HMP purposed joint powers authority in the case that an HCP JPA is not formed. We have talked about the HCP many times in board meetings, so this is a great opportunity to talk about the HMP and what it did and didn't accomplish. The HMP was signed in 1997. It established a habitat conservation area and corridor system and parcel-specific land use categories, management requirements for all lands on former Fort Ord. It's an agreement with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to allow transfer of Fort Ord property with cleanup by the Army that would have impacts on listed species. Those impacts were mitigated by predisposal actions in Chapter 3 and by the purposing of areas rich in special status species to becoming habitat reserves. Other areas were purposed for development or development with restrictions or reserves. The signatories agreed to manage the reserves and borderlands. It does not grant permits to develop in any of the parcels. It only designates where development would be allowed in future. On the top of this slide are the signatories of the HMP. These jurisdictions and agencies are the underlying owners of habitat areas or have easements. This group, if you ask me, is the logical starting point for considering who would participate directly in an HMP JPA. And here are the areas of the habitat reserves. I know it's finely detailed, but it has bright colors to see that BLM was given the largest area as part of the HMP. California State Parks was given the beach up to Highway 1. University of California was given the pink areas. The light blue is in the jurisdiction of Marina. Reserves and corridors shown in gold are owned by the county, and bright yellow is owned by Monterey Peninsula College. The tiny 19-acre area in the southwest corner of former Fort Ord that's in Delray Oaks, the HMP named Monterey Peninsula Regional Parks District as the area manager. The tasks of the HMP. The tasks basically boil down to resource management plans, RMPs, required for all habitat management reserves and development parcels with restrictions or reserves. RMPs are planning documents that provide the basis of what conservation activities will be done, periodicity of the activities, reserve access and management, and reporting requirements. The area under a single RMP may be a single habitat reserve, the reserve portion of a single development parcel, or groupings of parcels or reserves. The geographical area of an RMP and the content of an RMP are generated through the review by the CRMP, the Coordinated Resource Management Planning Group, that includes 14 members, including U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, BLM, many parties with staff that are experts in this field review your RMP with you. And they are accepted, they also require review and acceptance by wildlife agencies. The habitat reserve deeds that I go into for like 2 pages in my report, and I'm sure was scintillating, they're in there because that's where California Department of Fish and Wildlife are named as reviewing and approving agency of your resource management plan. Okay. So RMPs will include requirements to cut fuel breaks, do restorations, erosion control, stormwater runoff control, etc. And those things need permits that will have to come from the both wildlife agencies, because these are not federal lands that we're talking about, and those permits will need to be negotiated from scratch. The RMPs are to have specific protocols for managing biological resources to meet the overall goal of the HMP, which is to provide for, at a minimum, no net loss of populations or important habitat of any of the subject species of this HMP. And here is the condensed list. I couldn't fit them all in, so I just have a little line that says 5 manzanitas and chaparral plants. The star of this list is the California tiger salamander. Listed under Endangered Species Act and the California Endangered Species Act, this elusive creature spends some time in ponds and vernal pools and some time in upland habitat inside animal burrows. Between UC, Monterey County, City of Marina, MPC, and MPRPD, 2,472 acres of habitat is preserved in these habitat reserves. Going forward, you may hear us call this species CTS. Okay, more specifics on what would be expected in an RMP. To achieve the goal of no net loss species and area, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Department of Fish and Wildlife interpretation of that first bullet, beneficial enhancement, after 2 decades of limited conservation effort, and in the light that there is no base-wide HCP for conservation of species, may be more stringent and expensive than what is on paper in the HMP. Just thinking of CTS, beneficial enhancement, we'll start with assessing occupancy of habitat, what threats there are to individuals, and prescribing management to improve their lot. Other management requirements include erosion control, non-native invasive species control, access control, vegetation management, road and trail maintenance, and short and long-term plans for any non-habitat uses. As part of those plans, they need to identify measures to be implemented to avoid and minimize impacts on listed species that could occur due to siting, construction, etc. And that, I'm going to just skip to the next one. So, as you can see in the report, I started with reserve level responsibilities. If I'm going to attempt to add up, Jonathan and I attempted to add up the total costs of what an RMP would cost a jurisdiction. We had to start on the real detail level of what would be happening in an individual reserve, and then add that all up. So this project has a list of each reserve and information that I've gleaned from both the Hcp in terms of listed species and the Hmp in terms of species that they recognize are likely holding Hmp responsibility on that parcel. There's a call for surveys, and some particular RMPs call for monitoring, long-term species monitoring, but not all. There's a need for control of erosion issues and access control. And so questions of access control predict added costs of erosion control, invasive species control, and adaptive management. Generally, low-level access control, that is, locations with high visitor flow, will result in more erosion, more trail and road maintenance, and more non-native invasive species issues. And that is a more expensive habitat reserve. The comments under management level come directly from the Hmp document in Chapter 4. Some describe the need to do habitat restoration, some describe the need for prescribed burns. In this case, Garrison North needs to maintain existing habitat values for Monterey spineflower, sandgilia, and the chaparral species that are listed above. The responsibilities analysis assumes that all of this will be done and includes it in the cost estimate. But an RMP is co-designed. The jurisdiction can put forth what it and its biological consultants believe is necessary to meet the goal of the Hmp. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and CDFW approval is required. So there's also some notes under additional Rmp costs, and those highlight added costs such as additional fire breaks, prescribed burns mandated by the Hmp document, or anticipated added expense due to current conditions. And those conditions I know about because I spent a lot of my time working on the HCP and talking about it with the regulatory agencies and the wildlife agencies. The per species intensity of surveying, the conservation requirements, the adaptive management and reporting is projected to be lower than the HCP. So we pulled that out of the HCP model to make sure it wasn't equally representative as it would be in a full base-wide HCP. But the number of species under the Hmp is double that of the HCP. And as I might have mentioned or I might have glossed over, it says right in the Hmp that all the species that they have on their list should be treated as if they were listed. Okay, so that's how we put this together. Here comes Jonathan to tell you how it all adds up. Thank you.
So while Jonathan's coming up, I just want the board members to know that Mary's done a great detailed technical presentation. She doesn't just know this from what she's read and what she's prepared and written. She's at works in the field, directly doing restoration work. Mary has built cages for Yaden's Piperia. She's helped in the restoration in the field. She doesn't just know this because she's giving you a presentation. It's because it's all real.
Okay. So thank you, Mary, and Chair and Board. I'll continue this presentation. Get into the costs. So part of our mandate from our HCP workshop and board meeting last fall was to continue to complete the base-wide HCP, but this is coming back to the board on analyzing Hmp responsibilities and costs. So it's definitely good governance to want to know what Hmp and other possible scenarios could be as alternatives to the HCP. So staff has done our best. We've worked with colleagues in the field that are managing habitat reserves in compliance with Hmp. In particular, we worked with UC Natural Reserve, Gage Dayton, who came up with this initial cost estimate of $311,000 to do Hmp requirements on the UC reserve. As Mary mentioned, we looked individually at the reserves to see reserve by reserve, were there more species in a particular reserve, what was the reserve size, what was known about the reserve and the habitats there, what kind of adjacent land uses are next to the reserve. That kind of would indicate how much public access might affect erosion and might affect with having to do extra work and making accommodations for the species, whether that could be access controls with fencing or gates or what might be needed. And also invasive species control. That's a big cost in the reserves, is maintaining the reserves without taking out the invasive species that can crowd out the special status species. So in terms of looking at the Hmp costs, prior boards have asked that of us as well, to know what these Hmp management costs are and what that would be in comparison to an HCP. So we'll get to that towards the end of the presentation. Also, we have more information today than we had for those prior boards, since we have a cost model with HCP and we have more experience in the field of meeting our Hmp requirements with BLM's work and UC's work. So this is our estimated breakdown by jurisdiction. So UC is at the top with $311,000 annual costs. Monterey County is at $657,000 annually. City of Marina is at $462,000 annually. Monterey Peninsula College is $114,000 annually. That all adds up to $1.5 million roughly on an annual basis. There are startup costs. Since these reserves, to do an Rmp, you need to know what species are present and how best to manage the reserve. Also needed could be setting up fuel breaks, could be setting up fencing and access controls. So that's the ticket item is roughly 1.5 million. Okay, so looking ahead, how would you split that apart? Say we're in 2020, FORA has collected 21 million towards habitat management, towards HCP. There's no HCP. How do you split those dollars? So using that cost estimate, Monterey County would get the largest share of those dollars. City Marina would be next in line. UC would also receive a portion of those dollars. Monterey Peninsula College who has a negotiated in lieu fee instead of a CFD to pay to FORA. The park districts in question, they haven't paid to the FORA CFD. They likely won't have any fees to FORA. Would they be included? That's a question mark, open-ended. On the borderlands side of things, the Hmp does require borderlands. Our estimate, in addition to our annual costs, would be about $100,000 for those entities with borderlands. Those would include Seaside, County Monterey, CSUMB, primarily with borderland responsibilities. Okay, so looking at funding Hmp requirements through a JPA, there are definitely advantages to using one management entity versus 4 or 5 management entities. So pooling dollars, you can pool the resources, you can remove the redundancies and achieve economies of scale. So the economies of scales could be achieved by sharing the monitoring expense, having one consultant doing multiple areas all at one time during the monitoring periods that are needed could save some dollars. Having administrative staff pooled to do the annual reporting and having those people that are out in the field dealing with the invasive species control, that could also save dollars. Okay, so looking at the Hmp funding that's required. So if you look at, in the Hcp, we use different assumptions on the payout rate. We use 4.5% as a payout rate, and also with the wildlife agencies, minimum already pre-approved endowment holder of 3%. So if we took that 1.5 million and applied those payout rates, we're looking at a need of 35.1 million to 52.3 million as an endowment needed to implement these Hmp responsibilities that we've estimated today. This would include the startup costs, and this would be used toward those Hmp mandates that are currently unfunded for the jurisdictions. Just to note, using that $21 million that is expected to be collected by 2020, the additional add-on to get to those targets of 35 and 52 million would be roughly 13.5 million and 30 million to reach those targets after 2020. So in addition to what would be collected by 2020, there would be some more to fund based on these estimates. So that additional funding could be met through the FORA CFD special tax replacement, or if somehow that was extended, that could also be used. Or there could be another identified source. Okay, so that was about Hmp responsibilities. I want to also make this a presentation that compares permitting, since that would be a component of what would be needed for regional infrastructure projects, also for development projects within the jurisdictions. So I'm going to add this next layer of what does it take to, what permitting would still be required even after you finish your Hmp requirements. So when we look at regional infrastructure projects, I'm just picking a couple for this presentation. I'm going to start out with the FORTAG, the Fort Ord Regional Trail and Greenway. When you set up a trail, it takes a little bit more wider than the trail to develop that trail. So we have a rough estimate of about 19 acres within the habitat reserves would be needed of land would be needed to build the trail, as well with 140 acres within the development parcels on Fort Ord. So species present roughly in those areas would be the Smith's blue butterfly, California tiger salamander, red-legged frog, the spine flower, Seaside's bird's beak, and Sangilia. Many of those species need permits. And this is just a map to show where that regional trail would be on the base. As proposed, it's the blue trunk line is what we're talking about. So the blue trail that goes all along the way from north of the Marina Airport all the way south to Del Rey Oaks and City of Monterey. Okay, so talking about another infrastructure project that's base-wide would be Marina Coast Water District. So they have a capital improvement program, a long-range capital improvement program. We'd be looking at roughly 36 acres in HMAs and perhaps more acres within the development areas. Similar species would be affected in those areas that would be developed upon for those capital projects. And this is just a map to show where those are present. There's roughly 8 projects that we've identified that Marina Coast would need permits for. So this is roughly areas in East Garrison and the travel camp, also by BLM headquarters and even in state parks. Okay, so the species. You've heard about these species. They have benefited from the Army use of the base because their habitat was roughly left alone on the interior of the base, and they don't always stay within the habitat reserves. They go out into the development areas as well. Sanguilia is one of those state plants that needs a permit. So areas affected, you can see up in UC territory by the airport, City of Marina territory to the east of the Dunes project. City of Seaside has areas east of General Jim Moore Boulevard. Del Rio Oaks also has an area within its parcel east of General Jim Moore Boulevard. So Seaside's Bird's Beak is another state-listed plant, requires a permit. Areas affected would be the UC parcels by the airport, as well as MPC near the Parker Flats area, Seaside East, Del Rio Oaks, and City of Monterey in the south. Okay, CTS, that particular species that is both federally and state listed. As we mentioned before, there is a mitigation bank that's available within our region. The cost is estimated to be about $50,000 per acre of take. So it's not outlandish to say take could be 400 or 500 acres or more on the base, based on the upland habitat that affects City of Marina by the airport, Parker Flats area in the county, Seaside East, Del Rio Oaks, and Monterey. So if you're looking at just say roughly 500 acres of the base, times 50,000, you're looking at 25 million to mitigate one species. So if you add that on top of a 52 to $30 million endowment, you're already beyond Hcp costs. So that's just something to consider permitting on the base. And then this is just a final, we're nearing the end here, the final slide, before we get to the question slide, of jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So what development acres are available to the jurisdictions and what habitat reserve acres are also available. So some jurisdictions don't have any habitat acres on the base. City of Monterey and Seaside fall into that category, as well as CSUMB. But the other jurisdictions, there are some habitat acres available. Likely they would not be sufficient to permit all the development that is planned on the base. So any questions as we move ahead?
Any questions from board members on this presentation? How's the brain frying going? Okay, Director Hoffa and then Director Gagliotti.
So the City of Monterey does not have any land, any of our land in that habitat management area or reserves. We do have some protected species that we will need permits for. So if a potential JPA did not include permits as part of their mission, would there be any reason why the City of Monterey would want to participate?
Yeah, I would say since City of Monterey is, well, it would depend if the City of Monterey is funding the work that the JPA does. Currently, City of Monterey's development on FORA under the FORA regime, CFD fees would be paid so that in the City of Monterey, so they would want some oversight of that to ensure that the funds are being used properly. But depending on that scenario, if the funding source is not yet determined, that would be in question.
And when do we get the other half, the HCP costs, so that we can compare and contrast?
We do have an estimate on the HCP costs already. 48 million to 66 million is that range.
Sure. But not to the same kind of breakdown by jurisdiction.
Correct.
Exactly. So when would we might see something like that?
It's not exactly apples to apples, John. So the HCP is a comprehensive document that looks at what we would do on both these lands that are habitat management areas as well as including the national monument as part of a base-wide effort. And a lot of the effort includes enhancement of the BLM area, which would be a part of a program which the federal and state agencies would recognize. That provides a certain amount of take for endangered species that you can't get if you're just doing the HMAs. So you can't really match it up property for property because the work is not all on the same property.
No, I completely understand. Thank you for that clarification. I guess what I'm getting at is for this body to be able to make a decision on do we go HCP or HMP, we need to know what it's going to cost us by jurisdiction. That's very clear. I mean, that's impact. I mean, that's direct impact, and that's a really easy calculation to make there. But for the HCP, we would need to know that.
Okay.
I guess, will that
Yes, I think
presentation...
if I'm looking at Jen, is that already on the web, Jen?
Okay, so you're saying that the HCP and the financial breakdown by jurisdiction and by take permit and by species and all of that is on it's on FORA's website already?
This presentation is on the website.
Oh, this presentation is?
This is the useful slide for that.
Okay. At what point, so I think what Director Gagliotti's getting at is, at what point will we be getting an equivalent presentation about the HCP? And kind of how it works, and because it won't be a, well, anyway, when do we get that information?
Yeah, pretty much any time you want. We have the full analysis of the HCP. We've presented that here a few times, but we can do it again. You're looking more of a side-by-side. Can we do something like that, Jonathan? It's a bit more side-by-side analysis?
Yes. We could bring that back to the board next month if that's desired.
If most of you have already seen it, this would be my first view of it.
Thank you. I think it's timely. We had asked, because all the talk has been about the HCP, we wanted to know what Hmp entailed, and so now that we have this information, now we can do a comparison. So I think it's a good question and something for us to do. Director Moderato.
I think the key point is, and it was mentioned several times, but it really needs to be emphasized, that the HCP allows incidental take permits. The Hmp does not. So the cost analysis can only go so far. What the 20 years of HCP planning has done is given this board some assurance that you'll get incidental take permits. Going the Hmp route, each jurisdiction, like take Monterey for example, would have to find habitat, and they would have to, if it's a federally listed species, they would have to do a separate HCP for that and show where the habitat's coming from. And there's a lot of uncertainty there. You don't know how long it'll take. Took FORA 20 years, but it's multi-species, multi-jurisdiction, so it usually takes less for individual jurisdictions that I'm familiar with. But still, I think the saving grace of the HCP process is you've been through a lot of torture, and you know incidental take permits will result.
Thank you. And I had a question. Part of the cost was the development of the RMP, the Reserve Management Plan. With the HCP, has that part already been done as part of this 20-year process that we're in?
Yes, the HCP includes RMP preparation.
Great. Yeah, I think it will be useful to have a conversation about all of this. Yes, Director Morton, and was there somebody else over here who had a question or a comment? Okay.
So one of the questions that I had, the HCP absolutely understand what is just talking about is it fulfills the requirement for incidental take permits base-wide, where the Hmp does not, but those projects that have already been entitled already have obtained their incidental take permits, such as East Garrison, Marina Heights. The question that I had, when you talk about the Hmp, that each jurisdiction has to do that, and you had a list of all of us having different acreage. Is it an impossibility that everybody that has a responsibility under the HMP to have one reserve management plan, just like we were planning for the HCP, that all of us participate in, and to continue to fund it similarly to the model we're kind of envisioning for an HCP. We're setting aside 30% of our CFD. Basically, we're contributing $7,200 per residential permit, that if in fact we did one HMP and all the jurisdictions that have land up there continue to obligate $7,200 or whatever the number would be appropriate per residential permit to the funding of one reserve management plan. Is that feasible?
Well, so we don't know what the wildlife agencies would say. We know what they've said with the HCP. They are comfortable with one RMP for the HCP, but we haven't asked the question about the HMP. What the HMP requires is that each habitat reserve owner does an RMP.
So is it feasible to create the funding structure, the 21 million, plus the commitment of $7,200 per residential permit or whatever that is, that funding goes into an endowment and then gets allocated per acreage or per a pro rata based on this financial responsibility? I do understand some of the acreage has a higher cost than others, but it's fairly easy to figure out a ratio and to use the income produced from that endowment to contribute to everybody's responsibilities equitably. Is that feasible?
Are you talking about including the national monument in that?
No, my understanding would be that if in fact, and I'm asking this, my understanding is that the HMP has no national monument lands involved in it, but if we're doing an HCP, what we've required and imposed is that the BLM standard for protection of a portion of its acreage will have to be to a higher standard. So part of our funding in the HCP is to contribute to meeting the additional cost for that higher clearance level. Somebody explained that to us.
I think what we said was that it would be enhancing. BLM is already managing its lands for endangered species. This would be enhancements that would allow us to get credit for that as part of our overall HCP. And
HCP, but not applicable to the HMP.
Not applicable.
Right, so I'm making that distinction. So I'm asking these questions, obviously, because when you gave us your staff report on the HCP, item 7E, where the statement is made that the totality of the cost can be as much as 66 million. We've accrued 21 million after 26 years of existence, and the burden for the jurisdictions, regardless of how you participate, of 45 million is, at least in the city of Marina, we're very concerned that we do not want to backfill anything with our general funds because we don't have it. So that is the reason for these questions and trying to explore meeting the requirements that we are required to do, which is the HMP level, calculating what that would be, what would be the best way to achieve that, and then what's the difference in cost to go to the HCP level. And I'll make myself, just to make this clear, for the city of Marina, because our incidental take permits for our currently entitled projects have already happened, and because we have land in the HMP, that the difference between doing an HMP and an HCP is not going to be significantly different for us, except we're still trying not to obligate our general funds. And I think that's an objective. I know it's an objective of the county, having sat through some of your meetings, and probably of other jurisdictions as well.
Thank you. Any other questions from board members? Any members of the public with comments or questions on HMs or HCs or RMs or all kinds of?
Good afternoon. I'm Erin Harwain with Denise Duffy and Associates. and we are contracted through FORA and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to prepare the CEQA NEPA documentation for the HCP. And also we calculated all the take assessment and acreage calculations for the HCP. So I've been involved with it for a while, and longer than I like to admit, but I'm really happy it's got the momentum it's got to get to the finish line this year. And as John mentioned, there are a lot of new faces, and I think it's really important because the permitting process is very complicated for the Endangered Species Act, that the Hmp is an approved agreement between two federal agencies under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, and that Hmp allows the Army to dispose and reuse and clean up its property, and under that agreement it gets that take authorization. When non-federal jurisdictions take over their properties, you're not covered under the Endangered Species Act, and you have to go through Section 10 of the permit process, which involves the preparation of an HCP in order to get your take authorization. Now, everyone's been asking for years, why has HCP been taking so long? You have this Hmp, it's wonderful, it's agreed upon, it's approved. Well, the bottom line was, the agency said, this is not appropriate, the Hmp is not suitable, it's not appropriate, it's not sufficient, it's not adequate for the Section 10 permit issuance. Therefore, you need a more robust HCP, which is why our HCP is more expensive, even though we have less species. And we've been working to the grind to finally come to consensus. And what I'm afraid that maybe new members of the board might not understand is that if you go only Hmp and you say, oh, let's just implement the Hmp and forget the HCP, you're essentially opening up a new Section 10 process for yourselves to go through that to prepare another HCP. So Director Morton's talking about, what if we do one Rmp? Well, that's kind of what we're doing right now to get our Section 10 permit. So you're traveling down a path, and then at the end, you won't have take coverage for your development properties. So you're paying for the habitat, but not getting the benefits of having the take coverage. So I just want people to be aware that Hmp or no HCP, and unfortunately a cost comparison by jurisdiction is very difficult because it's apples to oranges. You're getting take coverage, you're getting something out of it to develop your properties versus paying for habitat management. And the cost per acre, there's different species involved, and I know I'm over 3 minutes, but I just wanted to just get that out there for you guys and be available for any specific permitting technical questions you might have.
Thank you. Any other member of the public with comments or questions on this item? All right, we'll bring it back to this board, and I think this is another informational item, right?
May I ask a question after that?
Please.
Comment. So there's available, and I appreciate what Aaron has just said, and I understand, that's what I'm saying, to the city of Marina, whether we do an HCP or an Hmp, we can accommodate, we're willing to accommodate either. But what I'm concerned about is this going to the $68 million. And I know that someplace in the FORA documents are the cost model that's being used to establish why we need $68 million. My question is, can we bring it to the board to analyze that cost model to see if there's a way to reduce the costs and still fulfill the HCP? For example, I know in that model we're looking at a contribution of, I can't remember exactly if it's 1.3 million per year, every single year from year one going forward, and that's difficult when you have 21 million that at 3% is going to generate 630,000 the first year. So I'm trying to analyze the cost, and I think that is the biggest hiccup for all of the jurisdictions in making this determination. So if we can look at that HCP modeling and determine, can we cut back the staffing? Can we use consultant services for actually doing the management, the part that's the federal government requires, and make it cost effective, that it can be achieved with the funds that we have generated in our CFD? That would be ideal. So I look forward to that being considered by whoever gets to make the agenda, which I think is the executive committee.
Can I
Yes, please. Director Cagliati.
That's an excellent point. And yeah, is that, can we kind of ask that question quickly? Is that process programmatic? I mean, does the agencies just come up with that endowment number, or is it negotiated, or is it fluid? Can we manipulate or change that?
So what is required of us making this application for HCP to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, is to come up with our best estimate. So that's what's required. They've told us, okay, if you include this in the plan, and this in the plan, this in the plan, all these requirements in the HCP, they say, we'll likely give you permits. We're giving you guidance until you make your application. So we've costed out those requirements using actual field data of what it costs BLM or UC to manage their reserves. And that's what we're required to do as part of this application process. We can get into the nitty-gritty of what those assumptions are. I don't think the requirements are set. But the HCP is set up to be scalable. So
Jonathan,
you don't need to develop all the acres on forward order to have all the take, then you wouldn't incur all of those 66 million in costs. So it is
the 66 million was not come by easily. It may not be believable, but we negotiate very hard on behalf of keeping the costs low, both to ourselves and to our successors, the jurisdictions. The requirement for what we do is very clear. We have, between the Army and the work that it's done, the state parks and what they've done, the University of California and what they've done over now 20 plus years, in the Army's case 25 years post the announcement of closure, announced the actual closure. We know the actual dollars it takes on the ground for managing these species through the RMAs. So this isn't a supposition, it's actual dollars, and then looking at what those annual costs are, what the regulatory agencies will mandate will be the factor we have to use, and how much will be generated in an account that we set up. So they're all prescriptive, they're approved at the state level in terms of the percentage that we get on the money. So we can bring that back and we can scrub it again, because we've never shied from scrubbing the numbers to see if we can get a better price. But it would be very difficult to rework that when it's going to be, this whole package for the HCP gets published, it goes this month and then gets published in the Federal Register next month.
So the documentation that I'm looking at, I agree with you, Michael, is that when you're talking about how much it costs to take care of Sangillia, that's a set cost. But the plan, the economic plan that FORA has put forward, at least that is accessible to us and to review, it has, I recollect, 8 full-time employees, 2 grant writers. It's got PERS obligations. It's got a huge overhead. That's the part that I'm trying to look at, is that the establishment of that entity can be done for less. Well, it may be very well that the HCP, about the work that you need to do to protect the California salamander and the Sangillia, is a static. I believe it's within our discretion on how we set up the structure, and that's what I'm asking to look at and review, because this HCP is being articulated as being more favorable for our members.
Good. I think we've got some idea of what we'd like to see in the future about those kinds of options. I want to return now to the consent agenda item 7E and the question of the word must in the first paragraph under background. So I guess what I'm wondering when I read it is that the Forward Order Reuse Authority must complete an HCP, etc. essentially, whether we do a base-wide HCP or we go with an HMP, we have to produce an HCP, right? So I think, I mean, that's how I read this, and that what we've been talking about is, you know, since 1997, FORA pursued a base-wide HCP. That's where we get to that. So, but I want to, this question was raised, and so I think we need to figure out what we're doing so that we can vote on that item today.
So to get to that question, so as I mentioned earlier about the 1997 base reuse plan environmental impact report referred back to completing an HMP implementing agreement. So that's the mitigation measure in the base reuse plan for the species on the base. That's the must. Now we know that document is no longer being considered by the wildlife agencies. We've gone through the HCP process. So I think we can amend this language to say must complete an HCP or other habitat plan for the base, because that is our requirement with the base reuse plan, that we fulfill that.
I think that would take care of it, but I'm just wondering if we can do it now since it's significant, or do we have to bring it back next month? Can we go ahead and just make this information, we can just change, add those words and make it still part of consent, or we pulled it out of consent?
I don't think you can change a board report that was printed, but we can make a note in the minutes. We can ask the deputy to say that the board wanted it to be clear that the terminology here was broader than the word must. And I think that should take care of it. You just want something in the record to clear that up.
Right, the insert that HCP or an alternative, yeah.
Yeah, so we can, I think the minutes could reflect that the board directed that kind of language be used in the future. And that would not require an action of the board, I don't think.
Okay.
Okay, so with that clarification on the record, are you comfortable moving the adoption, or the approval of item 7E?
Yes, so moved.
Great, thank you. Motion by Director Adams. Is there a second? Second by Director Oglesby. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Great, thank you. Good discussion. All right, we will move now to the Legislative Committee report.
Yes, Chair, members of the board, if you have already had an opportunity to review item 8D, it includes the minutes of the Legislative Committee from back in August. It includes reports that were provided at the last Legislative Committee meeting, and it has our draft legislative agenda that was reviewed by the Legislative Committee a couple of weeks ago, and they are recommending that the board adopt this. There are a number of items on our legislative agenda for the new board members. The legislative agenda incorporates the kind of federal and state interaction that the Fort Ord Reuse Authority has, either for supporting legislation that may come forward, or for taking specific action to take legislative actions, or in the case of federal and state agencies where they provide dollars that assist the Fort Ord Reuse Authority in implementing its policies or approved programs, are incorporated in a legislative agenda. This legislative agenda, the item A, talks about the FORA 2018 transition plan. And the legislative coordination issues. I mentioned in a prior item during this meeting that we are working with Senator Monning's office, as we believe we need to move forward with language if we are going to address certain specific issues. The proposed position on this one suggests that there are issues that may require legislative support, which would be post-FORA funding for the jurisdictions after FORA sunsets, that there's remaining jurisdictions' future liabilities are covered or mitigated, to clarify the local area formation commission and FORA's assignment and obligations. There was some confusion about that, and both LAFCO and others have asked for some clarification there, and all of the attorneys have suggested that we should get some clarification on the applicability for CEQA. There's a question about if there is an entity that, when I believe Kendall mentioned earlier, there might be an entity that would continue to deal with the distribution of funds, not a FORA staff, but maybe staffed by Seaside. There would be distribution of funds, or Marina, there would be something like that. And then what really is there a legislative role for the survivability of any existing contracts, agreements, including the base reuse plan and the policies? So I know that Senator Monning is looking at some issues that are important to continue, that have to do with FORA's role with veterans, that have to do with prevailing wage, that have to do with affordable housing, and there may be other legislative or ministerial actions that may be able to be taken. And so they're all incorporated here as a broad 20,000-foot policy statement to give for future action. There are items B, C, D, E, all the way through to item H on the legislative agenda. Item B is about the Habitat Conservation Plan. I won't go into detail about that since we had such an engaged discussion earlier, but the proposed position is to continue to move forward with the HCP, which clearly has a 20-year history, and it is existing for a board policy. The economic recovery and affordable housing support, clearly there are two current, I think it's AB 11 and SB, I forgot, there are two bills that are sort of the future redevelopment bills that talk about affordable housing as a priority for if you use redevelopment to get financing, but if you do make affordable housing a priority, you can also use it for infrastructure. So there's a couple of bills that are floating through. That's something that would probably help our jurisdictions going into the future for finishing the base reuse plan or doing affordable housing. And economic recovery is ongoing. It's not finished yet. So those have been support items in the past. We would continue that kind of support for any legislation that would help the jurisdictions post-2020 with carrying on the reuse and recovery. With respect to the Veteran Cemetery, I won't get into detail about that either, but this is a major important factor. I know there are veterans here today that have asked that there be specific language in this item to focus on the coordination with federal agencies and to seek potential legislative adjustment to make sure that the California Central Coast Veteran Cemetery is treated equally to other cemeteries across the state in terms of funding and support. So I think that's an important item, and that's in here, as well as they've also asked for the board to continue to support an entity that has regional presence to be addressing and advocating for our veterans' issues in the region. In terms of augmented water supply, this remains the same position that FORA has had in the past with respect to continue to working with MCD, the Monterey County Water Resources Agency, Monterey One, and others, and to coordinate with the Army or whatever entity is designated to oversee equitable distribution of the Army water. The language comes right out of our Economic Development Conveyance Agreement. In terms of legislative cooperation with Monterey Bay legislative issues, we continue to try to coordinate with all of our sister agencies and member agencies. We have essentially non-compete agreements where there is grant money available. We do not compete with any of the member agencies. TAMC and FORA, for example, over the years have been able to maximize grant funds by FORA getting transportation dollars that TAMC wasn't eligible for, and TAMC getting funds that FORA wasn't eligible for, and making sure that we match those up over the years. So that's just one example of the legislative cooperation. The next item is about assuring long-term stewardship of munitions cleanup areas. Earlier today, you heard about the work we have engaged with our regulatory agencies in the city of Seaside about FORA's future long-term stewardship. We may be able to get additional dollars and additional support for our jurisdictions about the stewardship of those areas, but currently we have a very positive working relationship with the Army and just completed some negotiations to provide additional dollars to make sure every munitions area is handled both for long-term stewardship and that all of the documents are approved. And then finally, I mentioned prevailing wages earlier. This has been a FORA policy for some years. I think Senator Monning has indicated that we continue to need to be I would call it vigilant in watching how the state handles these prevailing wage issues. We've seen how some of the approvals in the past have interfered with our ability to handle prevailing wage, and so this is a vigilance proposed position. Chair, that's my overview of the items that the Legislative Committee is recommending for your approval.
Any questions by board members at this point? All right.
You cannot start another item after 5.
Right. I think we're in the middle of one, so we're okay until we end it, and then we will.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Questions from board members on the legislative agenda? I did just have one. So as I understand the legislative process, the Senator Monning has introduced a holding pattern, a spot bill, and I guess my question is, at what point does that need to get filled in with specific language, and are we? What's the process by which this board can review and look at proposed language that FORA might forward to Senator Monning's office?
I'm going to ask Sherry Damon to give me some help on this as I answer that question. Senator Monning's office, we've worked with Bethany, worked with Toby consistently on this question. They've said that we need some language in the middle of March. We propose working directly with the Legislative Committee, taking an action here that would have the 20,000-foot view, take that to the Legislative Committee. We've asked them to meet on Monday to try to immediately start working on potential language. Sherry's been looking at what that draft language might look like with Les Gerard and others, and so we're prepared to move that to the Legislative Committee once this is adopted.
And if I can add to that, it also, this is Toby with Senator Bill Mine's office, it depends on what language is in there and what the request is. Just in the legislative process, if additional information is included in the request, and depending on what's in there, it depends on what committees it's referred to, and if it's double, triple referred. There's various different things, and that's why we have requested plan moving forward, hopefully, and they've been, that's why the March 11th date was set.
Yes, Director Martin.
So it seems premature before we complete the process of identifying what we need, which we just heard a report from RGS that they're working through that process. Our executive director indicated we've gotten so far, but we haven't gotten all the way. So from the standpoint of the city of Marina, our city position is that we will not support any action for extension of the CFD, because the extension of the CFD under the current statutory scheme takes away 12 different funding mechanisms from us as a jurisdiction unless FORA agrees to allow us to go forward. And I don't have enough information to even identify what's the potential governance structure, and that dispute, we all talked about that's a complicated issue. So from a standpoint of approving of this legislative matter, I cannot support it.
Thank you. I appreciate that there seems to be the thought that the Legislative Committee can make the recommendation, but I think it's important enough that it needs to be a full board discussion. Whether we come to a unanimous agreement or not, I think it will be important for Senator Monning's office to understand the conversation. So I'm a little concerned that there wasn't mentioned the opportunity for the full board to review what is being proposed in terms of specific language and take a position on it. Is there a way to remedy that?
If the board's decision is that it wants to get engaged, we could call a special meeting for next week once the Legislative Committee has had an opportunity to wrestle with the language, look through and figure that out, call a special board meeting and review that. I just want to be clear here, and Toby, help me out here, because once language is submitted, it's not going to stay the way it gets submitted. So that initial element needs to be looked at. We would be happy to bring that back if the board wants to set a special meeting next week. My understanding from Senator Monning's staff is the middle of March is the target for getting the language in.
So the middle of March is when we need to have language within the bill, and that's when it will be referred to whatever committees it's going to be referred to. Depending on where Senator Mines right now is waiting for the request of what the FORA board would like to see for any future transition assisting legislation. Depending on the tone of the legislature, we may have to make amendments. There's amendments throughout the whole process, either technical or significant, to ensure that the language does make it all the way to the governor's desk.
So my recommendation could be that you could have a motion to approve the legislative agenda, but to withhold submission of language on item A until it comes back to the board through a special meeting would be one way of approaching this.
Okay, I think I think that makes sense. I don't think that it serves. I think Senator Monning asked us to have a very transparent process, and unless this board, I mean, it's great that the legislative committee is going to work on this, and I appreciate that. It's really helpful to have them do an initial take, but unless this full board discusses it, it can't be construed as a board recommendation, as far as I'm concerned. So I'm interested in what other folks want to do about this. Director Morton and then Director Ramers.
So for the legislative committee to come up with whatever it wants to come up with, that is ABC, why do you need board approval of this legislative agenda on this matter? Because that's what the city of Marina cannot support. It's in principle asking for things that our city council unanimously voted that we could not support a continuation of FORA in any manner or a CFD. But if the legislative, the staff, the advisory consultant wants to come to the board with exact language, then that can be evaluated by each jurisdiction independently, however you want to do that, that you don't need a legislative agreement today. An agreement on a legislative agenda, to make that clear.
I was just looking at the report that we were given today by the transition Kendall. And at number 7, it's key issues in its structure of entity post-FORA with oversight for the CFD fund specifically, and it points to an option. One would be a successor agency with the groups that we've talked about, or option B with a joint power. And it seems to me that using that information could be the direction that we would want to give to the legislative committee to phrase the wording for a suggestion to the Monning office.
Thank you. Any other directors with comments? Director Oglesby, I see you moving towards the microphone.
Thank you, Chair. I understand the need to come back from the full board. That makes total sense. We should go ahead and vote for the item on the agenda today and come back if we have to, if it's not unanimous, but we have to get some type of direction. March, what was the day? March what? 11th. But that's my point. My point is the Senator Monty needs to have something to put on that spot bill so he can move it forward. If we don't need that bill can always go down in flames. You know, they know how to do that up there. But there's no need to. My point is, there's no need to have him hold a spot bill. Then we're not able to give him any language. We can figure out what we want to include later on. But I support the full board saying what we want.
Okay, let's try this. So I think there's some interest in moving the legislative agenda forward. The sticking point is the paragraph or the section A. So what if we if someone's comfortable making a motion to approve the legislative agenda minus A, and ask that the board, that the staff come back next week with a special meeting for us to review any specific language that might be forwarded to Senator Monning's office. Would that work?
So it would be, my motion would be approval of the legislative agenda with the exclusion in its entirety of Section A.
Yes.
That's my motion.
Great. Thank you.
And, and a special meeting, what was the date?
We don't know the date yet, but next week.
And a special meeting within a reasonable period of time.
As soon as possible, right. Great. So there's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. A motion and a second. Any discussion of the motion? Public, I can't remember where we are, but any public comment on this motion or on this item?
Yes, my name is Margaret Davis from Marina. I do support this motion, and I thank you for moving the RGS presentation to before this discussion. The point is that FORA is in the middle of a process adopted by the board, and you need to follow it to the conclusion and then focus on whether there's a need for a legislative fix. In this proposed position on 42 is ambiguous and vague. What is the legislation that the board is being asked to approve today? There isn't enough specificity for the public to comment or for board members to intelligently vote. For example, potential governance structure. What the executive director was referring to in writing this memo was not shared at the legislative committee meeting, and while it appears that this structure has been shared with some board members, it's not been shared with all. And also, survivability of existing contracts, agreements, documents, plans, policies. What is the intent? Does it mean legislation that will codify implementation contracts, or is it an extension of FORA so that contracts survive? Is a vote supporting this legislation a vote for the jurisdictions to be bound to implementing agreements and sharing land sale revenues with others? There's nothing open and transparent in supporting this legislative agenda without the additional information and participation in the process. The process has had 3 years of input. Please respect it and let it work out to completion before voting on legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Yes.
Is time now to comment on other than A? Is this only
Yes,
A?
anything on the legislative agenda
Anything on
and the
legislative
discussion.
Agenda. Okay,
Yes.
So I want to talk about D.
You may.
Okay.
Please do.
Okay, so my name is Sid Williams. A lot of you know who I am. A lot of new faces here. I'm here today representing the United Veterans Council of Monterey County. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Legislative Committee for this particular recommendation and thank FORA for a long partnership with the veterans community, particularly as concerns the Veterans Cemetery. We currently have 1,000 people buried out there, veterans and their spouses, from 15 states and 27 counties within the state of California. That clearly shows that we need to continue growing this cemetery. And anything that the FORA board and the FORA as an organization can do before sunset that will further that cause is a step in the right direction. The United Veterans Council, in conjunction with FORA, has worked to submit through our legislators, our state legislators in Assembly and Senate, to move legislation to make the operations and maintenance of this cemetery a part of the state budget, as it should be, since it's that way for IGO and is that way for an Orange County cemetery that isn't even existent yet. That's an important consideration. Also, in this process, as we go forward, this is the only veterans issue out on former Fort Ord that is multi-jurisdictional. Part of the land falls within the city of Seaside, part of the land falls in the county of Monterey, and when the cemetery goes forward to fruition, those entities will have to get their land given to them by somebody and then give that land to the state for the remainder of that cemetery. When you finalize your transition plan, I want to know who's going to be responsible to make that determination. The same thing applies to the endowment parcel, which is a major funding source for the cemetery. I would submit to you it's worthless today. But 25 years from now, this is a 50-year, 60-year project, the cemetery is. 25 years from now, we might be looking at a different picture, and there could be a lot of millions of dollars at stake on that parcel. There's an MOU that describes what will happen to that money. Who's going to be around to maintain that MOU and ensure that it's followed when that sale ultimately happens? These are very important issues to the veterans community in this county. They've stood up for you. How about you stand up for them? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public with comments on the legislative agenda? All right, we'll close public comment, bring it back. We have a motion on the floor. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. Passes unanimously. Now is the time that we need to take a vote to extend the board meeting. The essential item that we have left is the public comment period. So do we want to just say that we'll extend the meeting through public comment regardless of how much time that is?
Yes, I make the motion we extend through public comment.
All right, and we will be
comments
adjourned
from board
thereafter.
members.
Great. Okay, thank you. Motion by Morton, second by Garfield. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. All right, we will continue. Next item on the agenda is the public comment period. Any member of the public wishing to comment on items not on today's agenda, this is your moment.
I'll make it worth your while. Thank you for extending for public comment. I'm Erin Harwain with Denise Duffy and Associates. This time I'm wearing a different hat for public comment for the California Central Coast Veteran Cemetery project. We are contracted to prepare the NEPA CEQA document, which is coming out next month. We, on behalf of the state, so we're working with the Department of General Services and CalVet and USDVA. And we are, the CEQA document or the environmental document focuses on phase 2 of the master plan and then the build out for the next 100 years, phases 3 through 11. So it's a very comprehensive document. As you know, phase 1 has been constructed and that environmental document was approved a couple years ago. The state has continued its negotiations with the county to finalize a potential oak woodland restoration site as mitigation for phase 1. And we came before the FORA committee at the county last month. Was it last month? And we expressed that we are submitting a letter of proposal to come before the county board of supervisors. I'm in closed session because it is a land negotiation. And so on behalf of the state, we just wanted to thank you for the consideration of that proposal in advance, and we hope it gets to you very, very soon. And we hope that we can get that moving forward as the environmental for the remaining part of the cemetery moves forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other general public comment? Seeing no one coming forward, we'll close public comment and we'll move to items from members. Any members of the board? Director
Yes,
Morton?
I would just like to make a comment following what Mary Israel said. Today is International Women's Day. And when I participate in this board in particular, it is an honor to serve with women who have outstanding achievements. And the proclamation that so many of us passed in our cities, I just too would like to remind us here that this is an opportunity to recognize and reflect on the progress made to advance women's equality, to celebrate the gains made by women in our society, and reflect on the challenges and barriers which women continue to face. And we recognize that we all have played an extraordinary role in our history, and we continue to be a source of strength and leadership in our community. And I am appreciative I share that responsibility with those people on the board, both men and women. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other items from members? All right. With that, then, we are adjourned. Thank you.